Leo pressed his face against the chain-link fence, fingers hooked through the diamonds of rusted wire. Beyond the barrier, the old rail yard stretched out in moonlight, a graveyard of gravel and concrete pylons that once held up the city's elevated trains. His breath fogged in the November air. 16 years old, and he'd never seen a train run overhead, not in real life. The city had torn down the tracks when he was 3, sold the steel for scrap, paved over the dreams of an earlier century. But Leo collected what remained. Dog-eared transit maps from estate sales, black and white photographs of commuters in fedoras stepping off carriages, even a chunk of wooden railroad tie he'd found in a dumpster behind the Historical Society. His room smelled like creosote and old paper. He'd been planning this for weeks. The fence had a gap near the southwest corner where the posts had rotted, and someone, probably taggers or copper thieves, had peeled back the wire. Leo squeezed through, felt the metal scrape his jacket and dropped into the yard. Gravel crunched under his sneakers. Above him the pylons rose like enormous concrete ribs, supporting nothing but air and the weight of what used to be. He clicked on his phone's flashlight and picked his way between the rows, scanning the ballast for anything worth saving. A spike, maybe. A fragment of a tie plate. Anything that had touched the trains. 20 minutes of searching turned up bottle caps, a soggy work glove, part of a newspaper from 2009. Then his light caught something that didn't belong. A dull metallic glint half buried where 2 pylons met. He crouched and dug with his fingers. The object was heavy, cold, egg-shaped. He brushed away the grit and his heart kicked. A pocket watch. Tarnished brass case, cracked crystal face, and on the lid a tiny engraved locomotive with smoke curling from its stack. The hands were frozen at 12:17. Leo turned it over and found an inscription so worn he could barely make it out. Time spent is time lost. He sat back on his heels, cradling the watch. It felt older than the trains, older than the city maybe. The crown was stiff, but after some coaxing it turned. The watch began to tick, a sound like fingernails on glass, and the hands shuddered into motion. Leo checked his phone, 11:54 p.m. He wound the crown all the way and stood, holding the watch up to the light. The crystal was so cracked it looked like a spider web, but through it he could see the delicate mechanism turning. Beautiful. Then the air changed. A low thrumming, like a bass note, played through the ground itself. Leo froze. The gravel vibrated under his feet. Above him, between the empty pylons, something was forming. Lines of pale light sketching themselves across the darkness, rail by rail, tie by tie. Within seconds, a full elevated track hovered 20 feet up, glowing faintly blue-white, translucent as fog. Leo's mouth fell open. He heard no engine, no warning bell, but a train was coming. Silent and spectral, it glided into view from the east. 3 carriages of antique design, windows glowing, the whole thing made of the same ghostly luminescence as the tracks. It slowed as it passed over him and stopped, hovering directly above where he stood. He should have run. Instead, he stared at the watch in his hand. The minute hand was sweeping toward the 12, and as it touched that mark, 12:17 exactly, the train's doors hissed open. Cold air rushed down, smelling of metal and old upholstery and something else. Something like the air before a thunderstorm. A set of stairs unfolded from the nearest carriage, reaching down almost to the gravel. Leo looked around the empty rail yard, looked back at the stairs and made a decision that felt both insane and inevitable. He climbed. The interior of the carriage was empty. Rows of wooden bench seats, brass handrails polished to a dull shine, overhead lights flickering like candle flames. No conductor, no passengers, just him and the ticking of the watch in his pocket. He walked forward slowly. At the front of the carriage, where a route map should have been, there was instead a station board made of old flipping tiles, the kind that used to clatter in airports. But the destinations were wrong. They read, bus stop 7:42 a.m, line at the registrar 3:05 p.m, waiting room 9:11 a.m, bedroom staring at ceiling 11:34 p.m. Leo's skin prickled. He knew these. The bus stop on Harmon Street where he zoned out every morning. The registrar's office where he'd stood in line on his phone, barely noticing the 40 minutes pass. The hospital waiting room last spring when his mum had been called in for her shift and he'd sat there playing a game, bored and resentful. These were his minutes, the ones he'd thrown away without thinking, lost time. The board clattered and a new entry appeared. Math class 1:23 p.m. He remembered. Last Thursday, Mr. Ventura droning about quadratic equations, and Leo staring at a water stain on the ceiling for a full minute, his mind somewhere else entirely. The board highlighted the entry, pulsing gently. Leo reached out and touched it. The tile spun and locked. Destination selected. The doors hissed shut, the train lurched, and through the windows the rail yard blurred into streams of light. Leo grabbed a handrail, his stomach dropping as if he were in an elevator going sideways through time itself. Then everything stopped. The doors opened onto a familiar hallway. Third floor of the school, the math wing, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He could hear Mr. Ventura's voice through the open classroom door. Leo checked the watch. The minute hand was crawling forward from the 12. He had time. He stepped off the train into the hallway. The train vanished the moment his foot hit the linoleum. He was standing in the school at 1:23 p.m. on a Thursday. That had already happened, but he was fully aware, fully present. Inside the classroom, he could see his own back, his other self, the versioned, who had lived this minute the first time, staring vacantly at the ceiling. Leo felt a vertiginous doubling, like standing between two mirrors. He pushed open the door and walked to his desk. The other Leo flickered like a bad projection and dissolved. He was singular again, sitting in his seat, but this time he was paying attention. Mr. Ventura was mid-sentence. So when you're factoring, always look for common terms before you start applying the quadratic formula. Leo pulled out his notebook and actually wrote it down. He copied the example from the board. He asked a clarifying question. Mr. Ventura blinked, surprised, and answered. Leo felt the minute ticking past, felt himself living inside it instead of sleepwalking through. Then his pocket grew warm. The watch. He pulled it out. The minute hand was almost back to 12, completing its rotation. 60 minutes since he'd boarded. The classroom began to shimmer at the edges. He stood and walked to the door. No one noticed. They never did in these stolen moments. The hallway rippled, and suddenly the ghost train was there again. Doors open, waiting. He stepped aboard and the doors sealed behind him. Another lurch, another blur, and he was back in the rail yard under the stars, the spectral tracks fading above him. He checked his phone. 12:15 a.m. 1 minute had passed. But when he thought back to math class, he remembered it both ways now. The original bored minute and the new attentive one, layered over each other like a double exposure. And when he went to school on Monday and took the quiz, the formula was there in his head, solid and usable. He got a 91 instead of an 84. Over the next 2 weeks, Leo rode the hour hand railroad 6 more times. He went back to the bus stop and texted Mia instead of scrolling through nothing. They'd stopped talking after a stupid fight last summer, and in the original timeline that bus stop minute had been empty static. Now he wrote, "Hey, sorry I was a jerk about the whole talent show thing. Miss you." She wrote back 3 hours later, "Miss you too, weirdo." 1 minute rewritten, a friendship reopened. He went back to the hospital waiting room and instead of staring at his phone, he told his mum she was doing a good job, that he knew the double shifts were hard. She'd teared up a little and hugged him. That moment had been erased. Now it was full. But he started noticing things. After the third trip, the city bus that was always on time pulled up 4 minutes late. The driver looked confused, said his watch, and the bus clock didn't match. After the 5th trip, the school bell rang at 8:03 instead of 8, and the principal made an announcement about technical difficulties. Leo's mum came home from her nursing shift flustered because the hospital's scheduling system had put her in the wrong wing, and she'd missed the first 10 minutes of her rounds. On the local news, a segment about timing glitches, traffic lights desyncing, trains skipping stations, residents complaining their phone clocks and microwave clocks disagreed. The anchors laughed it off as Y2K-style paranoia. Leo sat on his bed, the pocket watch in his hands, and felt the weight of coincidence pressing on him. Every time he'd taken a minute back, the city had lost a little punctuality. It was as if there was only so much working time to go around, and by reclaiming his wasted minutes he was borrowing from the pool everyone else depended on. But he kept going. The temptation was too strong. He went back to a forgotten minute before a history test, skimmed one more page and aced the short answer section. He went back to a dull minute at the DMV and noticed his little brother Marcus in the parking lot looking lost. In the original timeline, Leo had been staring at a pamphlet about organ donation. Now he jogged outside, found Marcus and walked him home. Marcus had been planning to cut through an alley that night and got mugged in the first version. This time, it never happened. Mia noticed Leo's sudden luck. They were back to hanging out after school, spending afternoons at the diner on 4th Street, and she kept giving him these sideways looks. "You're different," she said one day, poking at her fries. "Like you're always one step ahead. It's weird." "Good weird or bad weird?" Leo asked. He was trying to sound casual, but the watch was heavy in his jacket pocket, ticking quietly. "I don't know yet," she said. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Have you noticed anything strange about the city lately? I've been working on this piece for the paper about timing problems. Buses bunching up, emergency services complaining about dispatch errors, people missing appointments because their clocks are all wrong. I'm calling it the timing plague." She laughed, but it was a nervous sound. "It's like the whole city is slipping sideways." Leo's mouth went dry. "That's a little dramatic, don't you think?" "Maybe." She stirred her soda with her straw. "But my mum's a dispatcher for the ambulances, and she says they've had 3 incidents this month where crews arrived late because the call timestamps didn't match the GPS logs. 3 incidents, Leo. People could die from that." He looked down at his plate. He wanted to tell her, wanted to show her the watch and explain everything, but the words stuck in his throat. If he told her, she'd tell him to stop. And he wasn't ready to stop. Marcus was safe now. His grades were climbing. His mum smiled more. These were good things. Surely they were worth a few late buses. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the watch on his nightstand ticking like a second heartbeat. He thought about the ghost train station board and all the minutes listed there. Hundreds, maybe thousands of lost moments from his own life. How many had he wasted? How many could he reclaim? The idea intoxicated him. He could optimize everything, fix every mistake, become the best version of himself by going back and back until there were no wasted minutes left. He could be perfect. He got out of bed, grabbed the watch and headed for the rail yard. It was 11:47 p.m. He squeezed through the fence, stood under the pylons and wound the watch. The thrumming began, the ghost tracks materialized and the train arrived exactly at 12:17. He boarded and scanned the station board. There it was, the minute he needed, kitchen 6:42 p.m. last Tuesday. He'd been making a sandwich, vaguely aware that his phone was buzzing in the other room. Marcus calling. Leo had ignored it, too focused on mustard and turkey, and later he found out Marcus had been trying to reach him because some kids were hassling him on the walk home. In the original timeline, Marcus had tried to take a shortcut through a construction site to avoid them and tripped, breaking his wrist on a pile of rebar. 3 hours in the ER, a cast for 6 weeks, and a look on Marcus's face like maybe his older brother didn't care. Leo touched the board. Destination selected. The train moved. He stepped into the kitchen at 6:42 p.m. on a Tuesday evening that had already passed. His other self was at the counter, assembling the sandwich in slow motion. Leo walked past him, through him, and felt the weird dissolving sensation as his past self evaporated. He grabbed his phone from the living room, saw Marcus's name on the screen and answered. "Hey, what's up?" Marcus's voice was small and scared. "There's these kids following me. I'm on Oakmont by the construction site." "Stay on the line," Leo said. "I'm coming to get you." He ran. He had the minute and he used every second of it, sprinting out the door, down the street, cutting through the alley. He reached Oakmont just as Marcus was veering toward the construction site fence. "Marcus!" The kids behind his brother, 3 of them, older, bored and mean, saw Leo and hesitated. Leo jogged up, put a hand on Marcus's shoulder and stared the kids down until they shrugged and walked off. Marcus's face flooded with relief. The watch grew warm. Leo checked it, the minute hand completing its circle. The world shimmered. He ran back the way he'd come and the ghost train was waiting at the end of the alley, impossible and real. He jumped aboard, the doors closed, and he was back in the rail yard, gasping, exhilarated. Marcus was safe. The wrist had never broken. Leo had saved him. But when he got home, his phone was buzzing with notifications, group texts from school, a news alert, a house fire on the east side. An ambulance had been delayed, dispatch timestamp errors again, and a woman had died of smoke inhalation before the paramedics arrived. Leo sat on his bed, staring at the screen. The fire had happened at 6:51 p.m, 9 minutes after he'd rewritten Marcus's minute. 9 minutes when the city's clocks were just a little more out of sync. He told himself it wasn't connected. Couldn't be, but the doubt gnawed at him. Over the next week, the timing plague got worse. Buses arrived in chaotic clumps or not at all. A train overshot the station and had to reverse, delaying thousands of commuters. Traffic lights cycled out of order, causing a 6-car pile-up on the interstate. Leo watched the news and felt sick. The watch sat in his drawer now, wrapped in a sock, but he could still hear it ticking through the wood. Mia called him, frantic. My mum got suspended. There was another ambulance delay and they're blaming the dispatchers, saying they're entering the times wrong, but Leo, she swears she's not. She says the computer clocks are changing on their own. That's awful, Leo said, and meant it. I'm going to figure this out, Mia said. There's a pattern here. I can feel it. He almost told her then. Almost. But fear choked the words. If he told her and she made him stop, what would happen to Marcus? The break would come back, along with the mugging, the fear. Leo couldn't undo that, so he said nothing. The ghost train was changing too. When he boarded it the next time, a late-night ride to fix a stupid comment he'd made to his mum last month, he found he wasn't alone. There were other passengers now, blurred and translucent, sitting in the seats or standing by the doors. They looked exhausted, hollowed out, and they muttered to themselves in voices like wind through broken windows. Missed the meeting. Late for the wedding. Never said goodbye. Leo tried to speak to one, a middle-aged man in a suit that looked decades out of style, but the man just stared through him and whispered, I was only going to be a minute. An older figure appeared at the front of the carriage near the station board. Tall and gaunt, wearing a conductor's uniform that might have been black or dark blue, or simply the colour of absence. The conductor carried a ledger, old leather-bound, and was making notations with a pencil that had no eraser. He glanced at Leo, and his eyes were kind, but infinitely tired. You're overdrawing, the conductor said. Leo's voice cracked. What? The pool of forgotten time. It's finite. Every minute you reclaim is a minute taken from the collective. The conductor tapped the ledger. The city runs on schedules, boy. Take too many minutes and the whole system unravels. I'm just fixing my mistakes, Leo said. I'm making things better. For you, the conductor said. But a city isn't one person. It's a million people all agreeing roughly on when things happen. You've been erasing that agreement minute by minute. He gestured at the other passengers. These are the ones who tried to take too much, missed their return window. Now they're part of the in-between, riding forever, trying to get back to moments that don't exist anymore. Leo looked at the blurred figures and felt ice in his chest. How do I stop? You give it back, the conductor said simply. Restore the minutes you took, but that means living them the way they were, the wasted ones, the painful ones. You can't be in two places at once. Giving time back means surrendering control. He closed the ledger. Choose carefully, the clock is still running. The train lurched and Leo stumbled back to the present rail yard, the conductor's words echoing in his head. He sat on the gravel for a long time, the watch heavy in his hand, trying to understand the shape of the trap he'd built for himself. The next day, he told Mia everything. They sat in her car in the high school parking lot after the final bell, and he showed her the watch, explained the ghost train, described every trip he'd taken. She listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When he finished, there was a long silence. So you've been rewriting conversations we had, she said finally. The text on the bus, that was manufactured. No, Leo said quickly. I mean, I chose to send it, but I meant it. I really did miss you. But you engineered the moment. Her voice was flat. You optimized our friendship. I was trying to fix things. You were trying to control things. She looked at him, and he saw anger and hurt and something that might have been pity. Do you even know what's real anymore, Leo? How many of your good grades were actually earned? How many moments with your family were genuine? Marcus is safe, Leo said, and his voice broke. I saved him. Her expression softened slightly. I know, and that's good. But you heard what the conductor said. You're breaking the city. My mum is suspended. People are dying because ambulances are late. You're playing God with time and the bill is coming due. He put his head in his hands. What do I do? Mia was quiet for a long time. Then she said, You give it back. They planned it together over the next 2 days. Leo would take one final trip on the Hour-Hand Railroad, but instead of reclaiming minutes, He would use it to undo his interventions. The watch had a mechanism they'd discovered. If he boarded the train and selected a minute he'd already rewritten, he could choose to restore it to its original form. It would mean reliving the wasted time, the boredom, the mistakes, the pain. But it would also return those minutes to the city's pool, resyncing the clocks, giving back the punctuality he'd stolen. The hard part was deciding which minutes to surrender. Leo made a list. The math class where he'd learned the formula, he could give that back. His grade would drop, but he'd survive. The DMV minute where he'd noticed Marcus in the parking lot, that one was harder, but Marcus hadn't been in real danger there, just inconvenienced. He could give it back. The hospital waiting room with his mum, he hated the idea of erasing that moment of connection, but he wrote it on the list anyway. But the kitchen minute, the one where he'd saved Marcus from the broken wrist and the mugging, that was where he stopped. He couldn't. He wouldn't. "You might have to," Mia said gently. They were in the rail yard, standing under the pylons as midnight approached. "If you want to give back enough minutes to fix the city, that's one of the big ones." "There has to be another way," Leo said. "Maybe," Mia said. "But maybe there isn't. Maybe the city's punctuality is worth more than one kid's broken wrist. I don't know, Leo. I can't make that choice for you." He looked at her, at the watch in his hand, at the empty rail yard that would soon fill with ghostlight and impossible trains. He thought about his brother, about ambulances arriving late, about the woman who died in the house fire while dispatch clocks disagreed. He thought about a million people trying to coordinate their lives and what it meant when the shared clock broke down. At 12:17 he wound the watch. The thrumming began. The tracks appeared, glowing and spectral, and the train arrived like a memory made solid. Leo climbed aboard. Mia stayed on the ground, watching. The station board was different now. Instead of just listing his wasted minutes, it showed two columns, borrowed and restored. The borrowed column had all the minutes he'd rewritten. The restored column was empty. Leo scrolled through the list, touching each entry carefully. Math class 1:23 p.m. Restore. The board clicked and whirred. Bus stop 7:42 a.m. Restore. Hospital waiting room 9:11 a.m. Restore. Each time he selected one, the carriage shuddered, and through the windows he saw the city's clocks beginning to align, second hands synchronizing, traffic lights cycling in proper order. Then he reached kitchen 6:42 p.m. His finger hovered over the entry. If he restored it, Marcus would break his wrist again. But the city would gain back a critical piece of coherence. Ambulances would arrive on time, trains would meet connections. The woman in the house fire, maybe she'd live, or maybe she'd still die, but at least the system would work the way it was supposed to. The conductor appeared beside him. "The hardest choices are the ones where both paths lead to pain," he said quietly. "But indecision is also a choice." Leo closed his eyes. He thought about Marcus's face when Leo had shown up on Oakmont Street, the relief and gratitude. Then he thought about Mia's mom suspended, about the traffic pile-up, about the slow unravelling of the city's ability to function. He thought about collective time versus personal time, about the difference between optimising your own life and living in a world with other people who also needed the clocks to work. He made his choice. He restored the DMV minute, the history test, the diner conversation. He restored almost everything, giving back minute after minute, feeling the train lurch as the city's timeline straightened. But when he reached the kitchen minute, he hesitated one last time, then moved past it. He couldn't. He restored other treasured moments instead. Peak grades, perfect conversations, small victories, draining his list of optimizations until only the essential ones remained. The kitchen minute, and a handful of others. The city's clocks. Weren't perfect now, but they were close enough. The restored column filled. The train shuddered to a stop. The watch's minute hand hit 12. The conductor nodded slowly. "Close enough," he said. "The city will hold." The doors opened onto the rail yard. Leo stepped off. The ghost tracks began to fade and the train with them, dissolving into moonlight and memory. He stood in the gravel, feeling the absence of the thrumming, and pulled out the watch. The hands had stopped. The mechanism was silent. It was just a piece of broken brass now, inert and heavy. Mia jogged over. "Did it work?" "I think so," Leo said. He looked at his phone. The clock read 12:24 a.m. In the distance he heard a city bus rumbling past on its route, probably on time or close to it. "I didn't restore everything, I couldn't. I know," she said. They walked back to her car together. Leo's life felt different now, less optimised, more real. Over the next few days he noticed the changes. His math grade dropped back to a B. The conversation with his mum in the hospital waiting room had never happened. She was still stressed, still distant. His text to Mia on the bus had never been sent. They'd reconnected in a different way, messier, slower, but maybe more genuine because of it. And Marcus was safe, wrist unbroken, because Leo had chosen to keep that 1 minute for himself. The city's timing problems didn't disappear entirely, but they stabilised. The news stopped talking about the timing plague. Mia's mum got unsuspended. Traffic lights cycled normally again. Life was humanly messy, full of small delays and minor frustrations, but not haunted. Leo and Mia decided to bury the watch back in the rail yard, under the same pylons where Leo had found it. They dug a shallow hole, wrapped the watch in an old bandana, and placed it carefully in the earth. Mia had written a note on a scrap of paper, and Leo tucked it into the bandana's folds. "Do not borrow what you're not willing to pay back." They covered it with gravel and stood. The pylons rose around them, holding nothing but air, and Leo realised he was okay with that. The trains were gone. The ghost tracks had faded. There were no more minutes to reclaim. He would have to live inside his life instead of constantly rewriting it. Accept the boredom and the mistakes and the wasted time. It felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure. "You think anyone else will find it?" Mia asked. "Maybe," Leo said. "Or maybe it stays buried forever." They walked out of the rail yard together, leaving the watch behind. Leo didn't look back. He had a life to live, minute by minute, and he couldn't afford to spend it looking over his shoulder at all the things he might have changed. The city's clocks ticked on, imperfect and synchronized enough, and that would have to be sufficient. Time moved forward. It always did. And Leo, finally, was ready to move with it. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The library smelled like old paper and lemon polish, the kind of smell that made you feel like time moved differently here. Eli pushed his cart down the narrow corridor between the stacks, the wheels squeaking against the scuffed linoleum. It was Thursday evening, nearly closing time, and he was alone in the old wing. Mr. Havers was probably at the front desk doing crosswords and pretending to look busy. Eli liked the quiet, liked that nobody expected him to be anything other than the kid who put books back in alphabetical order. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Nadia asking where he'd been after school. He'd blown off her zine meeting again, the third time this month. He'd meant to go, had actually walked halfway to the journalism room before his chest got tight and he'd turned around, telling himself he'd catch the next one. He was shelving a stack of ancient reference books when he noticed the gap. The rolling ladder stood against the shelf, and behind it, where the wall should have been, there was darkness, a space. Eli glanced back toward the main aisle, heard nothing, and squeezed past the ladder. The hidden aisle was barely wide enough for his shoulders. Dim overhead bulbs gave everything a sepia tone, and the smell changed. Less lemon polish, more ink and dust and something else. Something electric like the air before a storm. The shelves here were different, older, the wood dark and warped, and every single book was wrong. They were too thin for one thing, half the width of normal books, like someone had sliced them down the middle. But it was the spines that made Eli's hands go cold. Names and dates. Sarah Chen, March 3rd, Marcus Brown, July 15th, Olivia Kent, September 8th. Hundreds of them, stretching down the narrow space, and then Ely Morgan, October 19th. His own name, his own last name, in faded gold lettering. October 19th. That was 2 weeks ago. The day of the math presentation, the one where he'd frozen in front of the class and stumbled through his note cards while everyone watched him disintegrate. The day that cemented his reputation as the kid who couldn't handle pressure. Eli pulled the book from the shelf. It was light in his hands, the cover plain brown leather. He opened it. The alarm went off at 6:47 a.m. and Eli reached for his phone, swiping it off with practiced efficiency. He'd been awake for 10 minutes already, mentally rehearsing the opening of his presentation. Last night's practice session with the study group had helped. Study group? Eli didn't have a study group. He kept reading. Marcus had pointed out the weak transition in the middle section, and Sarah had suggested the graph formatting that made everything clearer. He felt nervous, sure, but prepared. He got out of bed and grabbed the note cards from his desk, the ones covered in colour-coded highlighting. The words started to blur. Not because Eli's eyes were tired, but because the ink seemed to be moving, rising off the page, like smoke. The aisle tilted. Eli tried to drop the book, but his hands wouldn't let go, and then everything dissolved into white noise and pressure, and the smell of coffee, and... Eli woke up at his desk, his bedroom desk, morning light coming through the window at the angle that meant early 7 a.m. maybe. His phone alarm was buzzing. He swiped it off and stared at the note cards in front of him, covered in careful highlighting. Blue for main points, yellow for supporting data, green for transitions. He didn't remember making these. "Eli, breakfast!" His mum's voice from downstairs, bright and cheerful in a way that felt off, or maybe felt right. His head hurt. He stumbled through getting ready, his mind racing. This was October 19th. He was living October 19th again, except it wasn't again because this version hadn't happened yet, or had it. The study group. He remembered now. No, he didn't remember. But somehow he knew. Marcus and Sarah and 2 others meeting in the library Tuesday and Wednesday, going over the material together. He could see their faces, could remember Sarah's laugh when Marcus made a dumb joke about polynomials. School happened around him like a dream where you're acting without choosing to act. He walked to math class, sat down. The teacher called his name. He stood up, note cards in hand, and started talking. The words came easily because he'd practiced them, because the study group had helped him organise his thoughts, because in this version of the world he'd done everything right. He didn't freeze, didn't stumble. Got through the whole presentation and sat down to scattered applause while Mr. Reeves nodded approvingly and wrote something in his grade book. Sarah caught his eye and grinned, giving him a subtle thumbs up. Eli felt sick. This wasn't his life. Or it was his life, but sideways, the version where he had made different choices starting a week ago. The day felt real. The cafeteria smelled the same. His locker combination worked. People treated him like he'd always been this version of himself. But underneath everything was a humming wrongness, like standing on ice that might crack. After school, instead of going home, Eli walked downtown to the library. He had to test something. Mr. Havers was at the desk, but he looked younger somehow, or maybe just less tired. Eli headed straight for the old wing, pushed the cart aside, found the gap behind the rolling ladder. The hidden aisle was still there. The same dim lights, the same 2 thin books. He found his own name, October 19th, pulled it from the shelf. The book was heavier now, fuller. He flipped to where he'd stopped reading earlier, or later, or whatever, and saw that the pages continued past that point, filling in with the day as he'd lived it. But the last chapter was still blank, still labelled Evening, with nothing but white pages underneath. The book explained it without explaining it. He understood in the way you understand dream logic. To get back, he had to reshelve the book before finishing the story, before living the last chapter. Now, while evening was still beginning. Eli slid the book back into its gap on the shelf. The spine clicked against the wood with a sound like a key turning in a lock, and the world lurched. He was standing in the regular library, the modern, fluorescent-lit library of his actual October 19th, the one where he'd bombed the presentation 6 hours ago. His phone showed 8:47 p.m. The cart was next to him. Everything was back, except his hand hurt. Eli looked down and saw a thin white scar across his left palm, diagonal from thumb to pinky. He had no memory of getting it. Hadn't had it this morning when he woke up. But it was there now, faded like it had been there for months, and when he pressed it with his thumb it felt tender like an old injury does. He stood in the quiet library and started shaking. Over the next 2 weeks, Eli went back 4 times. He couldn't help himself. The aisle called to him every shift, those half-thick books with his name on them lined up like pills he could take to cure different regrets. He jumped to the day he ditched Nadia's meeting and lived it over, showing up and helping lay out the zine, staying late to proofread. When he returned, he owned a copy of that issue with inside jokes scribbled in margins he didn't remember writing. Nadia hugged him when she saw him next and referenced things he only half remembered, but the memories felt real enough when she said them out loud. He jumped to a Saturday where he'd stayed home and instead lived the version where he'd gone to the skate park with some kids from school. Returned with a scraped elbow, and the muscle memory of how to kickflip, his body knowing movements his mind had never learned. He jumped to the day he'd eaten lunch alone and lived it with Kai from English class instead, the quiet kid with the good taste in music. When he came back, Kai nodded to him in the hallway like they did this every day, and Eli found himself humming a song Kai had played from his phone, a song he'd never actually heard in this timeline. Each jump left more leaks, a callus on his fingertips from guitar strings, a teacher asking about the club meeting he'd missed, except he'd never joined that club here, his mum mentioning a conversation they'd had about colleges, a conversation he couldn't quite remember but somehow knew the shape of. Nadia noticed first. She always noticed everything. "When did you get that scar?" she asked, pointing to his palm during lunch. "I don't know, a while ago. It wasn't there last week. I grabbed your hand during the fire drill, remember? No scar. Maybe you didn't notice." "Eli." She was using her journalist voice, the one that meant she was building a case. "Remember last month when you swore we had that huge fight about the deadline, and I kept saying we didn't, that never happened? Yeah, you forgot. I didn't forget. It didn't happen, but then yesterday I was going through my messages and I found this whole text thread where we did fight about it. Except I don't remember typing those messages. And you," she leaned closer, "you play guitar now? Since when? You told me last year you tried once and hated it." Eli's throat went tight. "People learn things. In 2 weeks? Eli, something's wrong. You're different. Not bad different, just like someone's been editing you." He almost told her then. Wanted to tell her. But the words stuck because explaining the aisle meant explaining what he'd been doing, meant admitting he'd been rewriting days without telling anyone, rewriting their friendship, their shared history. So he changed the subject and Nadia let him, but her eyes stayed sharp and worried. The 5th jump was different. Eli found a book dated from 4 months ago, mid-July, a random Thursday he barely remembered. But when he opened it, the alternate version showed his parents actually talking to each other. In his real timeline, that was the week they'd barely spoken, the week his dad slept on the couch and his mum worked late every night, and Eli had walked around the house like it was made of glass, the week he'd known they were thinking about splitting up but nobody said it out loud. In the book's version, teenage Eli had done something different, had actually asked them what was wrong instead of hiding in his room, had sat at the kitchen table and said, "I know something's wrong and I'm scared," and somehow that had cracked them open enough to talk. Not to fix everything, but to start. Eli jumped without thinking it through. Lived the day as the braver version of himself, the one who could sit in uncomfortable silence and not run away. Watched his parents actually communicate, saw his mum cry, saw his dad reach across the table and take her hand. It hurt to watch, but it hurt less than the cold silence had. When he returned, reshelving the book in that alternate library's hidden aisle, the change hit him like a wave. His parents were different. Still stressed, still struggling with money and work and all the things that never go away, but talking. Going to counselling. He found a family therapist's business card on the fridge. His dad squeezed his shoulder at breakfast and asked how he was doing, really doing, in a way that meant he cared about the answer. But the leak was massive. Eli couldn't remember the layout of his childhood home anymore. The house he'd lived in from age 6 to 12. He knew he'd lived there, could remember it existed. But when he tried to picture the living room, his mind went fuzzy. Like looking at a photo that had been damaged by water, the details smeared away. He mentioned it to his mum and she looked at him weird and said, "The blue couch, the brick fireplace. Eli, we lived there for 6 years." And he nodded, but the picture she painted felt like something someone had told him about, not something he'd experienced. That night he lay in bed, cataloguing the leaks, the scar, the guitar calluses, the skateboard moves, the friendship with Kai, the zine memories, the fixed relationship with his parents. His life was better on paper. Everything had improved. But when he tried to remember who he'd been 6 months ago, before the jumps the picture got fuzzy, like he was photocopying himself over and over and each version lost a little more resolution. The archivist found him on the 7th jump. Eli had gotten bolder, had started exploring books with dates he barely recognised, curious about how different his life could have been. This one was from a year ago, showed a version where his family had moved to a different school district. He jumped just to see, to sample what a completely different school would have been like. The library in this alternate day was smaller, shabbier, budget cuts evident in the worn carpet and flickering lights, but the hidden aisle still existed, and when Eli squeezed behind the ladder he found someone already there. An older man, maybe 40, with grey threading through dark hair and eyes that looked exhausted in a permanent way. He was running his fingers along the spines of books, hundreds of them, all bearing the same name, James Novak. "You're new," the man said. Not a question. Eli froze. "I was just exploring, testing, fixing things." The man smiled without humour. "I did the same. 20 years ago, though by now I'm not sure if it's 20 or 30 or if I ever actually left." He pulled a book from the shelf, riffled through pages covered in dense text. "I started small like you. Fixed a bad test score. Kept my girlfriend from breaking up with me. Got into a better college." He shoved the book back. "Then bigger fixes, career choices. My father's death. There was a version where I got there in time to say goodbye. My sister's wedding. A version where I wasn't in the hospital, where I gave a toast instead of missing everything." "You can't remember which is real," Eli said quietly. "I can't remember anything. Not really." The archivist gestured at the shelves. "I have hundreds of versions of my life on these shelves. Thousands of days I've lived and unlived and relived. At some point I couldn't find the thread back to the original anymore. Too many leaks. Too many borrowed details. The person I was before I found this place, he doesn't exist. Just approximations. Why don't you just stop? Leave the books alone? Because I don't know which timeline is mine to return to." The archivist's voice cracked. "I've jumped so many times that every version of my life has been edited. There's no baseline, no core. I'm here because here is the only place that makes sense anymore. The only place where all the versions of me exist at once." Eli backed toward the entrance to the aisle. "I can still get back. My books, they're only from this year. For now." The archivist caught his arm, gentle but firm. "Listen to me. There's a tipping point. You won't see it coming. One day you'll jump back and realize you can't remember what you were trying to return to. The details you've leaked will outnumber the ones you kept, and you won't know which life is the real one anymore. Stop while you still can." Eli pulled away and ran, found his book, reshelved it, snapped back to his regular library with his heart pounding. But the archivist's words followed him home. Nadia cornered him 2 days later with a poster board covered in sticky notes and string, a conspiracy theorist's nightmare. "I've been tracking it," she said, spreading it across his bedroom floor. "Every time you act weird, every time you mention something that didn't happen, or show a skill you shouldn't have, I thought I was going crazy, but it's you. Something's happening to you, and you won't tell me what." So he told her. About the aisle, the books, the jumps, about living alternate versions of days and reshelving to return. About the leaks. She listened without interrupting, her face cycling through disbelief and anger and fear. "You've been rewriting our friendship," she said finally. "That fight we had about the deadline, that happened in some other version and now I remember it too because of your leaks. Eli, I don't even know if this version of me chose to be your friend or if you edited me into it. It's not like that. It's exactly like that. You're playing God with everyone's memories and you didn't ask. You didn't think about what it means that I'm remembering things I didn't experience." She stood up, folding her arms. "No more. I don't care if it makes things better. No more jumps or I'm done. I can't be friends with someone I can't trust to keep reality consistent." Eli wanted to argue but couldn't. She was right. He'd been so focused on fixing things, on optimizing his life one jump at a time, that he hadn't considered what it cost the people around him, hadn't considered that leaked memories meant their realities were getting rewritten too. "Okay," he said, "no more jumps." But 3 days later he found himself back in the aisle anyway, not planning to jump, just looking, running his fingers over the spines. So many dates, so many versions of himself. And at the far end, one book he hadn't noticed before. Eli Morgan, January 8th. 8 months ago, before he'd ever found the aisle, before any of this started. He pulled it down. The pages showed a version of that day where he'd gotten a letter about a scholarship, a competitive program that would have sent him to a different school entirely, a boarding school for kids good at science. In his real timeline, he'd thrown the letter away. Too scary, too far from home, too much pressure. But in this alternate day he'd applied, had gotten in. The book showed him packing, saying goodbye to Nadia, driving away with his parents. Eli could jump to that day. could live the version where he'd been brave enough to try, see what kind of person he would have become, what kind of life he would have built. The book was there, pages waiting to be read, that other life waiting to be lived. He stood in the dim aisle for a long time, the book heavy in his hands, thought about the archivist lost among his own shelves, thought about Nadia's timeline wall, the evidence of his editing, thought about his parents and the childhood home he couldn't picture clearly anymore, thought about the guitar calluses and the scar and all the other details he'd borrowed from lives he never paid the full price for. Eli closed the book without reading past the first page, slid it back onto the shelf. The spine clicked home and he felt it, the temptation releasing, the door to that particular alternate life closing. He'd never know what that scholarship version of himself had become, never sample that path, and somehow, standing there in the dusty aisle, that felt like the first real choice he'd made in weeks. He brought Nadia back that night, showed her the aisle. She walked along the shelves with her phone flashlight, reading names and dates, her expression caught between wonder and fear. "There's so many," she whispered. Together they found all the books with Eli's name from the past year, 11 of them. Some thick with pages from the days he'd lived, some still thin. Eli ran his fingers over each spine, saying a kind of goodbye to the versions of himself inside. The one who aced the math test, the one who went to the skate park, the one who helped with the zine, the one who saved his parents' marriage, all the hymns he'd tried on like clothes. "I can't undo the leaks," he said. "The scars and skills and memories, they're stuck now. I'm stuck with this college life." "So make it yours," Nadia said. "You've got guitar calluses? Actually learn guitar. You've got skateboard muscle memory. Practice until you earn it. You've got a better relationship with your parents. Maintain it. Don't just wear the borrowed parts. Live into them." Mr. Havers was waiting when they came out of the old wing. He looked up from his crossword and studied them both for a long moment. "Found the aisle," he said. Not a question. "You knew," Eli said. "I knew." Mr. Havers set down his pencil. "I was young once too. Young and full of regrets. The aisle shows up for people like us. People who can't stop asking, what if?" He stood, pulled a key ring from his desk drawer, selected an old brass key. "I'll lock it. Not permanently, the aisle doesn't work like that. Can't be destroyed. But I'll lock it for now. Give you time to live forward instead of sideways." They watched him walk into the old wing, heard the click of the key in a lock Eli had never noticed before. When Mr. Havers came back, he pressed the key into Eli's palm. "Hold on to it. When you're older, when you've lived enough real days that the regrets don't burn so hot, you can decide what to do with it, but not now, not while you're still building a life." At home that night, Eli started a new notebook, plain, spiral-bound from the drugstore. He wrote the date at the top of the first page, November 7th, and started journaling. Not the highlight reel, not the optimized version, just what actually happened. The awkward conversation with Kai where they ran out of things to say, the guitar practice where his fingers fumbled the chords, the dinner where his parents were good but not perfect, trying but not fixed. All of it messy and real and lived only once in this timeline, in this version of his life. When he finished writing, the ink just sat there on the page, didn't shimmer or smoke or pull him anywhere. The words were just words, the day was just a day, and tomorrow would come without him having to shelve anything to get there. Eli closed the notebook and looked at his hands, the scar across his palm, the calluses from guitar strings, evidence of days he'd borrowed, choices he hadn't actually made but now had to live with. They were part of him now, leaked in from alternate lives, and maybe that was okay. Maybe everyone's life was a kind of collage anyway, built from chances taken and not taken, from the person you are and the people you might have been. The library key sat on his desk, brass and heavy and full of possibility. Someday he might use it again, might need to test another path, sample another version. But not tonight. Tonight he had this life, this exact configuration of choices and leaks and mistakes and small victories. It wasn't optimized, wasn't the best possible version, but it was his, earned and lived, and for now that was enough. The next morning, Eli woke up to his alarm without the dizzy feeling of not knowing which timeline he was in. Just Friday, November 8th. His room looked the same as it had when he'd fallen asleep. Same posters, same mess, same crack in the ceiling he'd been staring at since middle school. Nothing had shifted in the night. No new memories had arrived unbidden. The relief felt almost physical. At breakfast, his dad asked about the math test coming up next week. A normal question, no hidden weight behind it. Eli answered honestly, he was worried about it, hadn't studied enough yet, and his dad offered to quiz him over the weekend. Simple, linear, a conversation that would stay exactly as it happened, no alternate versions bleeding through. "You okay?" his mum asked, studying him over her coffee. "You seem different lately. More settled, maybe?" Eli thought about how to answer that. He was different. He was a person built from pieces of a dozen timelines, carrying skills and scars from days he'd only half lived. But he was also more himself than he'd been in months, paradoxically, because he'd stopped trying to optimize every choice into the best possible version. "I'm okay," he said, "just figuring some stuff out." School felt strange in its ordinariness. Kai nodded to him in the hallway and Eli nodded back, and this time, when they ran out of things to say at lunch, Eli didn't panic or wish he could, rewind and try again. He just sat with the awkward silence until Kai pulled out his phone and showed him a new song, and they listened together without forcing conversation. It was fine, not perfect, but fine. In English class, Sarah from the study group, the one that existed in some timelines but not others, asked him a question about the homework. Eli realised he had memories of knowing her from the math presentation jump, memories of inside jokes they'd shared, but in this actual timeline they'd barely spoken. The leaked familiarity made him answer too casually, like they were friends, and she looked confused for a second before smiling politely and turning away. That was going to keep happening, Eli realised. He'd keep running into the edges of his collage life, places where the borrowed pieces didn't quite match the actual history. He'd have to navigate that, figure out how to explain away the inconsistencies or slowly build real relationships to match the leaked memories. It would be awkward and complicated, and there was no book he could open to see how it turned out. After school, instead of going to the library, Eli went to the music store downtown. He'd been avoiding it because the guitar calluses felt like a lie, a skill he'd stolen from an alternate version of himself. But Nadia's words kept echoing. "Make it yours." He browsed the used guitars, found a beaten-up acoustic that fit his budget, and bought it along with the beginner's instruction book. At home, he sat on his bed and tried to play. His fingers knew where to go. The muscle memory from the leaked timeline was real enough, but the sound that came out was terrible. Buzzing strings, muted notes, everything slightly off. The alternate Eli had apparently been better at this. But this Eli, the real one, would have to practice, would have to earn the skill his body already half remembered. He played for an hour, fumbling through basic chords, until his fingertips hurt and his mother knocked on the door to ask if he could please take a break. The frustration felt good, though. Clean. This was him actually learning something, not borrowing it from a life he'd visited for a day. His phone buzzed. "Nadia. Want to work on layouts tomorrow? Actual timeline version. Promise to remember all of it." Eli smiled. "Yeah. Coffee shop at 10. Bring the guitar. I want to hear how bad you actually are." Saturday morning, Eli met Nadia at the coffee shop with the acoustic slung over his shoulder in its cheap gig bag. She was already there, laptop open, surrounded by printouts and marker sets. The zine was coming together, a November issue about things people regretted which felt almost too on the nose. "Play something," Nadia said, grinning. "I'm terrible." "I know. That's why I want to hear it. I want to hear the real you being terrible, not the borrowed you being adequate." So Eli pulled out the guitar and butchered a simple chord progression, while two people at the next table looked over with expressions somewhere between amused and pained. Nadia laughed so hard she nearly knocked over her coffee, and Eli laughed too, and it felt right. This was a real moment, fully lived, no alternate version hovering underneath. They worked on the zine for 3 hours. Eli wrote a short piece about regret, carefully not mentioning anything about libraries or alternate timelines, focusing instead on the weight of wondering what if. Nadia edited it with her usual ruthless precision, crossing out entire paragraphs and scribbling suggestions in the margins. They argued about word choices and layout decisions, and Eli realised this was the first time he'd done this with her in his actual timeline, not a borrowed one. Every previous memory of working on the zine together was a leak, a false history, but this was real. "Can I ask you something?" Nadia said during a lull, wrapping her hands around her second coffee. "Do you regret it, using the aisle?" Eli considered. The honest answer was complicated. I regret how much I used it. I regret not thinking about how it affected other people. But I don't know if I regret finding it in the first place. It taught me something. What? That optimized isn't the same as lived. All those alternate days, they were better versions on paper. Better grades, better relationships, better choices. But they weren't mine. I didn't pay for them. And trying to collect all the best possible versions of myself just meant I stopped being any version consistently. Nadia nodded slowly. The archivist guy you told me about, he's still there? In the aisle? I think so. Stuck between all his versions. That's sad. Yeah. They sat with that for a moment. Then Nadia pulled out her timeline board, the one she'd made tracking all of Eli's inconsistencies. I've been thinking about what to do with this. It's evidence of something impossible, right? The kind of thing I could write about, make a whole issue around, but I don't think I will. Why not? Because it's your story, and also because some things are better as lived experiences than documented ones. If I wrote about it, tried to prove it, it would become about the mystery and the magic, but the actual important part is just you figuring out how to live with your choices. That's not a mystery, that's just being human. She folded up the board and stuck it in her bag. But I'm keeping it, for the record, in case you ever get tempted to unlock that aisle again and need someone to show you what happened last time. Thank you, Eli said, and meant it. That afternoon, Eli's parents asked him to come to their therapy session. Not to participate, just to sit in the waiting room, to be present as they worked on things. It was part of the commitment they'd made. The leaked version of them, the ones from the timeline where Eli had been brave enough to ask what was wrong. Except now he had to be brave enough to maintain it, to keep showing up, to not let the borrowed fix dissolve, back into comfortable distance. He sat in the waiting room reading his English assignment while his parents talked to their counsellor in the other room. Through the walls he could hear the murmur of voices, occasional raised words, then quiet again. It was uncomfortable. He wanted to leave, to go back to his room and pretend everything was fine, but he stayed. That was the work now. Staying present, living forward, not escaping into alternate versions where the hard parts had already been resolved. When they came out, his mother's eyes were red, but she was smiling. His father looked exhausted, but lighter somehow. They took him out for pizza and didn't talk about the session, just ate and joked and argued about toppings like a normal family. It wasn't perfect. The leaked fix hadn't made everything magically better, but it had opened a door, and now they all had to choose to keep walking through it, day by day, in this timeline only. Sunday, Eli practiced guitar until his fingers ached. Monday, he showed up early to school and asked Sarah if she wanted to actually be study partners, building the relationship from scratch instead of relying on leaked memories. Tuesday, he went to the skate park and fell a dozen times trying to relearn tricks his muscles remembered, but his mind didn't fully understand. Wednesday, he wrote in his journal about all of it. The failures, the awkward moments, the small victories that didn't feel particularly victorious in the moment. The brass key stayed on his desk, catching light from his window. Sometimes Eli picked it up, turned it over in his fingers, felt its weight. The temptation was still there, would probably always be there. The knowledge that he could unlock the aisle, pull down a book, sample a better version of any day that wasn't going well. But knowing he could do it and choosing not to, that was its own kind of freedom. The freedom of accepting that this life, this exact sequence of days, was the only one he'd fully inhabit. Messy and imperfect and unrevisable. His. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The bookstore smelled like wet cardboard and something sweeter underneath. Maybe old glue or the particular mustiness of pages that had outlived their readers. Rowan pushed through the door more to escape the rain than out of any real interest in books, shaking water from their jacket onto the warped floorboards. The owner didn't look up from behind the counter, just kept sorting through a box of paperbacks with the resigned efficiency of someone who knew most days would end without a sale. Rowan wandered past sagging shelves of self-help manuals and celebrity memoirs, fingertips trailing along spines that left faint dust lines on their skin. In the back corner, wedged behind a stack of romance novels with shirtless men on the covers, something caught the light differently. A slim notebook, leather-bound, the kind of object that looked like it should cost more than the $5 price tag tucked into its pages suggested. Rowan pulled it free, felt the weight of it, substantial but not heavy. The leather was worn smooth in places, darker where hands had gripped it over years or decades. The pages were thick, almost parchment-like. with that faint yellow tinge that came from real age, not manufactured vintage aesthetic. What made Rowan actually look closer was the writing underneath. Not the current blank pages, but the ghost of text beneath, layers of it, like someone had written and erased the same pages over and over until the paper held the memory of words it no longer displayed. Rowan tilted the notebook to catch the fluorescent light, trying to make out shapes, but it was too faint, too confused with other layers. Inside the front cover, though, one line remained clear, written in ink that had gone brown with time. "A week is all you ever really own." It felt like the kind of profound nonsense that belonged in a fortune cookie. But there was something about the handwriting, the deliberate formation of each letter, that made it seem like a warning someone had meant. Rowan bought it for $4 after the owner agreed to knock off $1 for water damage that didn't actually exist. At home that night, still damp from the walk back, Rowan sat at their desk and opened the notebook to the first blank page. The paper was smooth under their fingers, almost soft, and their pen moved across it with less resistance than normal, the ink seeming to sink into the fibres rather than sit on top. They wrote the date at the top, Monday, April 3rd, 3 days ago. The day everything had gone spectacularly wrong. The quiz in history had been a disaster. Rowan had studied the wrong chapter, somehow convinced themselves that the test was on the Cold War when it was actually on Reconstruction, and had sat there for 40 minutes writing answers they knew were completely off base, watching the clock and feeling their grade point average crumble. Then lunch, where they'd snapped at Mara over something stupid, something about borrowed headphones and not returning them, but really about the accumulated tension of a friendship that felt lately like it was held together with fraying thread. The fight had escalated faster than either of them meant it to, and Mara had walked away mid-sentence, leaving Rowan alone at their usual table while everyone pretended not to notice. And then, because the universe apparently believed in piling on, there had been the incident in English class where Rowan had tripped over someone's backpack strap, sent their binder flying, and had to collect scattered papers while Mr. Chen paused mid-sentence, and the class watched in that particular silence that was somehow louder than laughter. Rowan wrote a different version. In this one, they studied the right chapter because they double-checked the syllabus Sunday night. The quiz was easy, or at least manageable, the kind where you finished early and felt that quiet confidence of knowing you'd done well. Lunch happened differently too. Mara brought up the headphones first, apologetically, explaining she'd left them in her gym locker, and Rowan laughed it off because in this version they weren't already wound tight from academic failure. They ate together, shared fries, made plans for the weekend. In English, Rowan's path to their desk was clear. No backpack to catch their foot, no scattered papers, no moment of exposed clumsiness in front of 26 witnesses. The writing came easily, details filling the page front and back, the ink flowing like Rowan was remembering something that had actually happened, rather than inventing something that hadn't. They signed their name at the bottom, a flourish they wouldn't normally bother with, and set the pen down. The room lurched, just a little, like a brief moment of vertigo, the floor seeming to tilt before settling. Rowan's phone buzzed on the desk, a staccato rhythm of notifications arriving all at once. They picked it up, thumbs sliding across the screen to unlock it. Texts from Mara, 3 from Monday afternoon. OMG, that quiz was so much easier than I thought. You finished before me, you nerd. Want to split loaded fries tomorrow? Another from Tuesday morning. Still thinking about that thing you said about Chen's terrible dad jokes. I'm going to crack up next time he does the Dickens voice. Rowan scrolled up, looking for the fight, the angry messages, the cold silence. Nothing. Just normal conversation. The easy back and forth of friends who hadn't spent Monday lunch hissing accusations at each other. There was a photo too, posted to their close friend story on Monday evening. Mara and Rowan at their lockers. Mara making a face at the camera. Rowan mid-laugh in the background. Rowan didn't remember that photo. Didn't remember the moment, the context, what had been funny. They opened their school portal, hands not quite steady. The history quiz grade was posted, 87% B+. Not perfect, but solid, respectable. The kind of grade that didn't drag down an average or require explaining to parents. Rowan sat very still, staring at the notebook. The ink of their signature had dried darker than the rest of the text, almost black against the faint yellow of the page. Around the edges of what they'd written, Those ghost layers of the old handwriting seemed more visible now. Or maybe it was just the angle of the desk lamp, the way the light caught the texture of the paper. Later, getting a glass of water in the kitchen, Rowan paused at the fridge. There was a photo held up with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. Rowan at maybe 7 or 8, gap-toothed and sunburned, standing in front of a playground, their old elementary school, Oakwood. Rowan knew that, could remember the name, the general location, the fact that they'd gone there from kindergarten through 5th grade. But the specifics, what had the playground actually looked like? There had been a slide, red or blue or yellow, the colour wouldn't quite solidify in their mind. A mural on the wall of the building painted by some artist who'd visited. Something with animals or maybe trees or possibly both, but the image was blurry, like trying to remember a dream hours after waking. The layout of the equipment, where the swings were in relation to the basketball court, whether there had been monkey bars or a climbing wall or both, it was all fuzzy, indistinct, like someone had smudged the photograph of their memory. Rowan shook their head, blamed it on being tired, and went back to their room. Over the next 3 days they experimented, carefully at first, just small things. Tuesday had featured a clumsy conversation with Jordan, the person Rowan had been halfway crushing on since September, an interaction in the library that had involved a lot of stuttering and an accidentally knocked over pencil case. Rowan titled a page Tuesday, April Ford and wrote it smoother. Coherent sentences, a shared laugh over a terrible pun, Jordan writing their number on Rowan's hand in blue pen. They filled the page, signed it, felt that small lurch again. Their phone showed a text from an unknown number sent Tuesday evening. "Hey, it's Jordan, in case the pen washed off." Wednesday's cafeteria incident, slipping on something wet, catching themselves on a table edge but still drawing attention and scattered applause from the jackass table by the windows, got rewritten into a non-event, just a normal lunch where nothing went wrong. Another page, another signature, another lurch. And with it, another memory going soft around the edges. Rowan's grandmother's voice, the specific cadence of how she said Rowan's name, the accent that revealed her childhood in a different country, the warm rough texture of her hands. All of it dimmer now, like someone had turned down the brightness and contrast, leaving just the knowledge that she'd existed, that she'd been important, without the sensory details that made her real. The pattern became clear through trial and error. To change a day within the last week, you wrote a continuous entry titled with that date. Front and back of a page, no stopping, no crossing out, no gaps in the narrative. Then you signed your name. The world would shift, would bend reality to accommodate what was written, not through impossible magic but through subtle alterations, conversations that went differently, timing that changed, choices that diverged. People still acted like themselves. The notebook couldn't turn someone cruel into someone kind, but circumstances aligned. Words came out better, disasters were avoided, and every time something older vanished or thinned. A memory with no connection to the rewritten day. Something from years past would lose resolution. The smell of their grandfather's garage, oil and sawdust and something metallic. The exact way their childhood dog Pepper had barked. The particular pitch and rhythm of it. The layout of the apartment they'd lived in before their parents' divorce. Which rooms connected to which, where the kitchen window had looked out. The memories weren't completely erased at first. Rowan knew these things had existed, could cite them as facts, but the emotional weight, the sensory details, the feeling of actually having experienced them, that leaked away like water through cupped hands. Rowan also discovered that reversal was possible but difficult. Taking a blank page, titling it with a date already rewritten, and describing what had actually happened in complete truthful detail, front to back, then signing, that could restore the original timeline. But it required accuracy, and once a day had been rewritten, remembering the original version became harder. People's behaviours in the new timeline created new memories, new reference points. Trying to reconstruct what had really happened was like trying to reassemble a sandcastle after the tide had come through. By the end of that first week, Rowan's days were objectively better. The quiz grade was solid, no cafeteria humiliation, things with Jordan were promising, Mara was a constant supportive presence. But Rowan would catch themselves mid-thought, reaching for a memory that should have been there and finding only fog, their grandmother's favourite song, the name of their first best friend from preschool, the plot of the movie they'd watched 100 times as a kid, the one that had made them feel safe during their parents' worst fights. Gone. All of it. Or so faded it might as well be. The notebook itself seemed to darken with use. Those ghost layers of old writing beneath Rowan's entries became more visible, pressed up against the current text like they were trying to surface. Squinting at them in good light, Rowan could sometimes make out partial dates, fragments of sentences in different hands. Someone else had used this notebook, multiple someone else's over years or decades, writing and rewriting and writing again until the pages held the memory of a dozen lives. When everything went completely wrong, it was a Thursday, 2 weeks after Rowan had found the notebook. Their younger sibling Casey, 11 years old and convinced they were invincible on a bicycle, took a corner too fast on the way home from school and collided with a parked car. The call came while Rowan was in calculus, their dad pulling them out of class with a face that made Rowan's stomach drop before any words were said. Casey was at the hospital with a broken arm, fractured collarbone, and a concussion that had the doctors watching closely for swelling. Rowan sat in the waiting room while Casey was examined, while their parents spoke in low, urgent voices with doctors, while the afternoon stretched into evening. Casey would be okay probably, but the probably was doing terrible things to Rowan's ability to think about anything else. Their little sibling, who'd been annoying them about a video game that morning, who'd stolen the last of the good cereal, who was supposed to be invincible because they were 11, and nothing truly bad was supposed to happen yet. That night, home finally. Casey asleep in their room with their mother camped out in a chair by the bed. Rowan opened the notebook, titled a page, Thursday, April 13th, wrote a version where Casey took the turn slower, where the timing was off by 30 seconds so the bike path was clear, where they arrived home with nothing worse than homework complaints. Rowan wrote carefully, mapped out every part of the afternoon they could think of, made sure Casey was safe in every version of every event. Front and back, no gaps, signed at the bottom. The lurch was bigger this time, lasted longer, made Rowan grip the edge of their desk. When it passed, the house was quieter. Rowan walked to Casey's room, pushed the door open slowly. Casey was at their desk, hunched over homework, left arm moving normally, no cast, no sling. They looked up when Rowan entered. "You need something?" "No, just checking on you." "Weird, but okay." Casey turned back to their math worksheet. Perfectly fine, perfectly whole. The afternoon's disaster erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Rowan went back to their room and opened their phone, looking for the photographs their dad had texted from the hospital, the updates on Casey's condition. Nothing. The text thread was mundane. Stuck in traffic, starting dinner without me from earlier in the week, a reminder about a dentist appointment, a question about whether Rowan had finished the college application essay. No emergency, no hospital, no Casey in a paper gown with a white cast and frightened eyes. But something else was gone too. Something bigger. There were photos on Rowan's phone from a trip 2 years ago. Their dad and Rowan driving up the coast over spring break, just the two of them. Rowan knew this had happened. Could see the pictures. Roadside diners, a beach with black sand, themselves grinning in front of an enormous redwood tree. But they couldn't remember being there. Couldn't recall the conversations in the car, the feeling of the trip, why they'd gone, what they'd talked about. The photos looked like pictures from someone else's vacation, interesting images of a stranger who happened to look like them. Rowan's hands were shaking. They closed the notebook, shoved it to the back of their desk drawer, tried to convince themselves they wouldn't use it again. That resolution lasted 3 days before Mara announced she was done. They were at Mara's house, supposedly studying for the physics exam, but really they'd been talking, and the conversation had drifted into territory Rowan should have known to avoid. Mara had been mentioning more and more lately how things felt off, how Rowan seemed different, distant, like they weren't fully present even when they were sitting right there. And Rowan, tired and rattled and still reeling from the cost of saving Casey, had gotten defensive. Words were said, the kind that couldn't be unsaid, implications about who needed who more, about whose problems were actually worth worrying about. Mara stood up from her bed, closed the physics textbook with a decisive thump. "I think you should go." "Mara, come on, I didn't mean—" "I know exactly what you meant. We're done, Rowan, I can't keep doing this." The door closed behind Rowan with a quiet click that felt final. At home, Rowan didn't hesitate, didn't try to talk themselves out of it. Open the notebook to a fresh page. Monday, April 17th. The fight had happened today, Monday evening, which meant it was still within the 7-day window. Rowan wrote it differently. The conversation staying light. Physics problems actually getting solved. A discussion about summer plans instead of accusations about emotional availability. They wrote Mara laughing, making plans for the weekend, the evening ending with a hug, and promises to text later. Page front and back, every detail, signature at the bottom with extra force. The lurch, the shift, the settling of a new reality. Rowan's phone showed texts from Mara, sent an hour ago. I still don't understand kinetic energy, but at least we tried. Hey, you forgot your calculator here. Want to see that new horror movie Saturday? But the cost this time was massive. Rowan sat at their desk, trying to remember the family trip from 4 years ago, the one they'd taken the summer before high school, all 4 of them together before the divorce really took hold. They knew it had happened, could see their mother's Facebook photos from it, tagged locations in national parks, captions about family bonding and making memories. But trying to pull up any actual memory from that trip was like reaching into empty space. Where had they gone? Mountains or coast? What had they done? Had it been fun or tense? Had Casey been 7 or 8? The photos showed events Rowan had apparently participated in. There they were, in shot after shot, but it felt like looking at a well-documented stranger's vacation. Rowan found Mara the next day at lunch, slid into the seat across from her with a relief so intense it made their hands unsteady. Mara looked up from her sandwich, smiled easily. Hey, you find your calculator? Yeah, thanks. Rowan hadn't lost a calculator, had never left one at Mara's house in the current timeline, but the lie came automatically. Mara, can I ask you something weird? You always do. Do you ever feel like things aren't quite right? Like the week has been off? Mara tilted her head, considering. Off how? Like, do you remember us fighting yesterday? Yesterday? We studied physics at my place. You were in a weird mood, but we didn't fight. Why did you think we were going to? No, it's just... Never mind. Forget it. But Mara was watching Rowan more closely now, a small line forming between her eyebrows. You've been strange lately, you know that. Not in a bad way, just... I don't know. Sometimes it feels like you're out of sync with everything else. Rowan wanted to explain. Wanted to pull out the notebook right there in the cafeteria and show Mara everything. Make her understand why things felt off. Why Rowan sometimes responded to conversations they didn't remember having. Why they occasionally looked confused by inside jokes that apparently only existed in the current version of reality. But how did you explain that you'd been rewriting the world? That the past 2 weeks were a palimpsest of better outcomes built on top of erased disasters? That the foundation of your entire life was being quietly removed one old memory at a time? I know, Rowan said finally. I'm working on it. Over the next week, Rowan kept using the notebook. Not compulsively, they told themselves. Just when it mattered. A college interview that went badly, rewritten into success. A family dinner that devolved into arguments about money and whose fault the divorce had been. Smoothed into civil conversation and passing bowls of pasta. An audition for the spring musical that had been a disaster of forgotten lines and pitchy notes, transformed into a confident performance that earned a callback. Each time, the trade. Older memories losing colour, losing weight, losing truth. Rowan's first day of middle school. The moment they realised they loved playing guitar. The funeral for their grandmother, which they knew had happened, which they knew had been important and sad, but which now felt like a historical fact rather than a lived experience. The first time they understood their parents were going to divorce. Casey's first words, their own first words, family legend repeated in stories they could no longer feel the truth of. And the timeline itself was scrambling. Events from years past were still factually correct. Rowan could cite dates, confirm details against external records, but the emotional sequence was wrong. A minor embarrassment from 8th grade felt as vivid and significant as the day their grandmother died. The time. They'd gotten lost at a theme park at age 6 carried the same weight as the conversation where their father had moved out. The first time Jordan had smiled at them in the hallway felt more important than the entire summer they'd spent learning to swim. Rowan was building an optimised present on top of a past that was not only hollow but reordered. Priorities shuffled like someone had taken their entire childhood and adolescence and arrange them by the wrong metric. Mara became an anchor without meaning to. She kept detailed planners, voice memos to herself about the day's events, texts that referenced specific conversations and moments. As Rowan rewrote more of the current week, the disconnect between Mara's careful records and Rowan's reshaped reality grew. Mara would reference something Rowan had said that Rowan didn't remember saying, would bring up plans they'd apparently made that didn't exist in Rowan's memory of how the week had gone originally. The dissonance was small enough to hide, but Rowan could feel it widening, a growing gap between the world as others experienced it and the world as Rowan was crafting it. One evening, unable to keep it in any longer, Rowan tried to explain. They were at the park near Mara's house, sitting on swings that hadn't been designed for teenagers but worked well enough. The light was going golden, the temperature dropping, and Rowan heard themselves saying things that sounded unhinged even as they said them. It's like living in a house where someone keeps repainting the walls but the foundation is being removed. Everything looks better but it feels thinner. Does that make sense? Mara pushed herself gently back and forth, the chains of the swing creaking. Not really, but I believe that it feels that way to you. Things are better now, objectively better. Grades are good, I'm not embarrassing myself constantly. Jordan actually likes me, you and I haven't fought in weeks. But I can't remember what my grandmother's voice sounded like. I know I went on this trip with my dad, but I can't remember any of it. There's a photo of me in elementary school and I can't tell you what the playground looked like. Maybe you're just stressed. College applications, school, everything. It's a lot. Maybe. But Rowan knew it wasn't stress. Knew exactly what was causing the holes, the reordering, the sense of living a life that was technically theirs but emotionally belonged to someone else. That night, Rowan examined the notebook more carefully. In good light, with patience, those ghost layers of old writing could be partially deciphered. Different handwriting, different inks, different dates stretching back decades. One section, about 2/3 through the notebook, was dense with text in a cramped collegiate hand. Rowan could make out fragments. November 14th, rewrite the breakup. November 15th, fix the exam. November 18th, undo the call home. Then later entries, more desperate. November 14th again, write it exactly. As it was, she said she needed space, not that she hated me. We were at the coffee shop, not the library. Attempts to restore, to undo, to get back to the original version. And then, near what must have been the end of that person's use, pages of text that barely made sense, words becoming disconnected, sentences fragmenting, like someone trying to write coherently while their grasp on sequence and meaning was falling apart. The last clear line in that section. I can't remember which version was real. Rowan closed the notebook, hands cold. The breaking point came when Rowan tried to undo one of the earlier rewrites. They wanted back the day of the history quiz, the fight with Mara, the stumble in English class. Wanted to prove to themselves they could restore something, could reverse the cost, could get back at least one piece of authentic past, even if it was painful. They took a blank page, titled it Monday, April 3rd, and tried to write exactly what had actually happened. But the details were gone. Rowan knew there had been a quiz. That was a fact. But had it been multiple choice or essay? What specific questions had tripped them up? The fight with Mara? What exact words had been said? What had started it? The headphones or something earlier? Had Rowan been the one to walk away first, or Mara? In what order had things happened? Morning classes, then lunch, then the stumble, or had the stumble been first? Had their dad made dinner that night? Or had they ordered pizza? Or had Rowan just eaten cereal alone in their room? Rowan sat over the blank page for an hour, pen hovering, trying to reconstruct something they could no longer clearly see. Every version they started to write felt like it could be right, but also could be wrong. Another alteration, another layer of false text on top of already obscured truth. Without accurate memory, any attempt to restore the original was just creating another rewritten version, another permutation, another coat of paint over foundations that were no longer there. They were trapped, stuck in a week that was objectively better, good grades, intact friendships, no humiliations, no disasters, but built on top of a past that had been gutted and reordered until Rowan couldn't trust their own memory of who they'd been, or what had mattered, or what had made them themselves. Rowan found Mara the next morning before first period. pulled her into an empty classroom and showed her the notebook. Explained everything. The rewrites, the cost, the way the last 2 weeks had been systematically optimised while Rowan's childhood and early adolescence were being erased or scrambled. Mara listened without interrupting, her face cycling through expressions: scepticism, concern, something that might have been belief or might have been worry about Rowan's mental state. When Rowan finished, Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Show me my planner." Rowan handed it over, watched Mara flip through pages of her own careful handwriting, detailed accounts of each day, times and events and snippets of conversation. Mara compared her entries to Rowan's descriptions of what had actually happened, the original versions before rewrites. The discrepancies were obvious. Days where Mara's planner showed smooth sailing while Rowan described disasters, events that Mara had recorded in detail that Rowan claimed had never happened in the first version. "Okay," Mara said finally. "I don't know if I fully understand this, but I believe something is happening, and I believe you need to stop. I have stopped. Mostly, you need to actually stop, and you need to try to get back at least one real day, even if it was bad. Something you can be sure actually happened." That evening, Mara came over with her planner, her phone full of screenshots and voice memos, her laptop with calendar entries and photos. They spread everything out on Rowan's bed. A map of the last 3 weeks according to someone who hadn't been rewriting reality, who'd just been living through it in linear time. Mara walked Rowan through each day, reading entries, playing audio notes to herself, showing texts that reference specific moments. "Here," Mara said, pointing to an entry from late April. "This was the day you said something in the car about feeling like you were watching your own life from outside. I made a note because it seemed important. You were quiet all day after that." Rowan didn't remember that conversation, didn't remember the car ride or the feeling or saying anything like that. But they could see it in Mara's neat handwriting, dated and timed, a record of something that had apparently mattered enough for Mara to write down. They chose a day, Friday, April 21st, just 3 days ago, a day that Rowan had rewritten twice, first to smooth over a disaster of a physics lab where they'd somehow managed to break expensive equipment, then again when that rewrite had caused different problems with the lab partners. Mara's records showed the original version, Rowan dropping a digital scale, the crack of breaking glass, the teacher's disappointed face, the rest of the lab period spent cleaning up and apologising. Embarrassing, grade lowering, the kind of moment that stuck with you, but real. Something that had happened to Rowan, not to an optimised version they'd scripted. Using Mara's detailed records, Rowan reconstructed the day as exactly as possible. The physics disaster went first, described in full awkward detail. Then lunch, where Rowan had been too upset about the lab to eat much and had vented to Mara about being clumsy and useless. English class, where they'd been so distracted they'd barely heard the discussion. Walking home in rain, arriving damp and frustrated, snapping at Casey over something trivial, hiding in their room until dinner. All of it painful, all of it imperfect, none of it the kind of day anyone would choose to preserve. But it was the truth, the actual thing that had happened before Rowan had decided it was worth trading old memories to erase it. Rowan filled the page, front and back, signed their name at the bottom. The lurch came, stronger than usual. Or maybe it just felt stronger because this time Rowan was choosing to make things worse, choosing to put back a disaster they'd already fixed. The room settled. Rowan's phone showed texts from that Friday, Mara sending sympathy about the physics lab, making jokes to try to lighten the mood, suggesting they study together over the weekend to prepare for the next lab. A photo from that day, taken by Casey through Rowan's bedroom door. Rowan at their desk, head in hands, looking defeated. But something else came back too. Not completely, not perfectly, but warmer than before. The memory of their grandmother's voice, the specific way she'd said Rowan's full name when she was trying to get their attention, the accent, the warmth. Not all the details, not the full weight of it, but enough to feel real again, enough to remember having loved her rather than just knowing it as a fact. Rowan closed the notebook and looked at Mara, who was watching with the careful attention of someone witnessing something they didn't fully understand but recognised as important. "Did it work?" Mara asked. "I broke the scale again," Rowan said, and found they were almost laughing. "I'm back to being clumsy and terrible at physics. Good." You were always terrible at physics. It's part of your charm. Over the next week, Rowan didn't open the notebook. It sat in the desk drawer, leather cover smooth and dark, pages full of rewrites and attempts and the ghost layers of previous owners who'd made the same bargain, trading depth for polish, past for present, truth for optimization. Rowan could feel the temptation every time something went wrong. A conversation with Jordan that was more awkward than they'd hoped. A calculus test that kicked their arse. A family dinner where the tension was thick enough to choke on. The notebook was right there, offering the chance to smooth it all over, to make this week perfect, to never have to live with the consequences of being clumsy or inarticulate, or just ordinarily imperfect. But Rowan remembered the previous owner's last words, visible beneath layers of other text. I can't remember which version was real. Remembered the feeling of looking at photos from their own childhood and seeing a stranger. Remembered trying to recall their grandmother's voice and finding nothing but fog. Some of the rewrites couldn't be undone. Some days would remain in their optimized versions, emotionally lighter, less real. Some memories from further back were gone entirely, or so scrambled in importance that Rowan could no longer trust what had actually mattered and what hadn't. The foundation of their past was full of holes now, walls repainted so many times the original structure was unclear. But Rowan could stop here, could refuse to trade any more authentic memory for scripted perfection, could learn to live in a present they earned rather than one they wrote. On a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, Rowan wrapped the notebook in plain brown paper, sealed it with tape, and wrote across the front in large letters, "This book steals your real life slowly." Added below smaller, "You can rewrite your days, but you lose your years. Not worth it. Don't use it." They packed it in a box with bubble wrap, addressed it to the university library's special collections department, with a note saying it was a historical artifact that should be archived and sealed, not circulated. Then Rowan went to the drugstore and bought a normal spiral notebook, the cheap kind with a cardboard cover, and brought it home. Sat at their desk that evening and wrote about their day in all its flawed, unedited reality. The calculus test they'd probably failed. The conversation with Jordan that had been awkward in some moments, nice in others, ultimately just human and imperfect. Dinner where their dad had made pasta and the sauce was too salty but everyone ate it anyway. Casey showing them a drawing from art class. Texting with Mara about nothing important. The writing wouldn't change anything, wouldn't reshape the day, wouldn't smooth over the rough parts, wouldn't trade future memory for present perfection. It was just a record, ordinary and honest, the kind of thing you wrote to help yourself remember rather than to rewrite what you'd want to forget. Rowan signed their name at the bottom, not as a magical seal, but just as proof. This happened. This was real. This was mine. Outside, the evening was settling into night, and somewhere in a mailbox the leather notebook waited to be collected and delivered and locked away, where it could be studied but not used. Rowan closed their cheap spiral notebook, set it on the desk next to the lamp, and felt the particular relief of knowing that tomorrow would happen once, in whatever messy way it happened, and that they'd have to live with it. The future would be earned the hard way, one unedited day at a time, but at least it would be theirs. Incomplete, but authentic. Imperfect, but real. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The storm hit on a Tuesday, shrieking in from the northeast with the kind of fury that made even Grandad Owen, who'd spent 40 years as lightkeeper, pull the curtains and turn up the radio. By Wednesday morning the harbour looked scoured clean. Boats that had been swaying gently at their moorings now sat askew, lines tangled, one dinghy beached halfway up the public steps. Marin found her father already down at the shop, assessing damage to the hull of Mrs. Chen's sailboat. "Could have been worse," he said, running his hand along a fresh gouge. "Jetty took the worst of it." Marin walked out along the breakwater after helping him secure loose tools. The old lighthouse rose behind her, its lamp long since automated, Grandad's cottage at its base looking small against the grey sky. The jetty stones were slick with kelp and smelled of salt and diesel, but something caught the morning light differently than it had before. Where algae had crusted the rocks for as long as Marin could remember, the storm had scrubbed them nearly bare. And there, just below the high tide line, was brass. She crouched, tracing the metal with one finger. It was a disc, maybe 2 feet across, bolted directly into the jetty stones. Concentric rings were engraved with tiny figures. Constellations, she realised, her heart quickening. Orion, the Pleiades, Cassiopeia. Each constellation sat in its own segment, arranged around a central pin that looked like it could rotate. A single line was etched deep across the diameter, pointing north. Words in old script ran along the outer rim, as above, so below, let tide keep true. Jules is going to lose his mind, she said aloud. She took photos from every angle as the tide crept in, then texted her best friend. By the time the water covered the disc completely, Jules was already biking down from his house on the hill, his drone case strapped to his back. An astrarium, Jules said that evening, both of them perched on the jetty as the tide pulled back again. But why bolt it into a breakwater? These things were for calculating planetary positions, not... Look. Marin pointed to a small notch in the outer ring, now exposed as the water receded. There's a mechanism. I think it only engages when the tide hits a certain height. Jules leaned closer, his headlamp illuminating the intricate gearing. Low tide, has to be. When was the last midnight low? Marin pulled up her tide app. Tonight, in about 4 hours. They brought Grandad Owen down at 11:30, the old man moving carefully over the uneven stones. He stood looking at the brass disc for a long time, saying nothing, while Marin and Jules waited. Your grandmother, he finally said, used to tell me the jetty remembered where it used to be. I thought she meant metaphorically. He touched the central pin, then withdrew his hand. Be careful what you align, Marin. The coast and the charts don't always agree, and there's usually a reason. You knew this was here? Suspected. Never had the courage to look, he squeezed her shoulder. Low tide's in 20 minutes. I'll wait up at the cottage. If you're not back by dawn, I'm calling the Coast Guard. Magic or no magic. The tide retreated, leaving shallow puddles on the flat stones around the astrarium. Marin lay on her stomach, checking her star app, then looking up at the November sky. Orion hung low in the east, brilliant even with the harbour lights. She could see his reflection in the largest puddle, wavering slightly. Okay, she said. If I rotate this so Orion on the disc matches Orion in the puddle. You're going to try it? Right now? Jules grabbed his phone. At least let me get the GPS coordinates locked first. She waited while he fussed with settings, her hand on the central pin. It moved smoothly when she pulled it up, releasing the rings. The brass felt warm despite the cold air. Slowly she rotated the disc, watching the tiny engraved Orion turn to align with the reflection below. Cassiopeia next, the Pleiades. One by one, the constellations matched their watery mirrors. Marin, the meridian line has to point north when you... The first small wave of the incoming tide crossed the engraved line. The world tilted. Marin's stomach dropped like she'd missed a step in the dark. Sound muffled, then roared back, but different. The electric hum of the harbour lights was gone. In its place, the slap of water against wood, the creak of rope and voices distant but clear, speaking in the particular careful way of people working at night. She looked up. Oil lamps hung on posts along the shore. The lighthouse beam swept the harbour, but slower than she was used to, more golden. Her father's boat shop wasn't there. Instead, rough scaffolding marked where the jetty met the land, and men in dark coats were hauling stones into position. Jules! Her voice came out wrong, too loud, panicked. But Jules wasn't there. She was alone on the jetty, the brass disc under her hands still warm. The date in her mind, it had to be. She looked at the constellation pattern, tried to remember which years matched this configuration. Late 1800s, 1880s maybe. The realization hit her like cold water. She was there. Actually there. A man appeared on the jetty behind her, carrying a shuttered lantern. You there? This is a construction site. What's your... He stopped, taking in her jeans, her waterproof jacket, her LED headlamp. What in God's name are you wearing? Marin scrambled backward, nearly slipping. Her hands found the astrarium, and she did the only thing she could think of. She checked her star app. No signal, useless, and tried to remember what the sky looked like from her own time 4 hours ago. She rotated the disc frantically, approximating, guessing. Orion higher, Cassiopeia more to the west. The central pin clicked. She held her breath as another wave crossed the meridian line. The tilt, the drop, the roar. She was back. Jules was still bent. Over his phone, fingers frozen mid-swipe. He looked up. Did you feel... I went back. The words tumbled out. Jules, I went back. There was someone there. And the lighthouse. It was real. It was... Back where? But his GPS was showing an error. That's weird. The coordinates are off by like 15 centimetres. Let me recalibrate. They found the discrepancy in the morning light. The mooring ring that Mrs. Chen had been complaining was too far from her usual dock position. Marin had tied boats to it 100 times, always a good metre clear of the jetty edge, was now half embedded in the stones, as if the rock had grown around it. Sensor error, Jules said, but he didn't sound convinced. Marin touched the brass disc, already disappearing again under the rising tide. We changed something. Coming back, I mean. We changed where the jetty thinks it should be. They tested it carefully over the next 2 weeks, making small jumps. Just an hour back, then 2, then a few years. Each time Marin aligned the astrarium to match a past sky, she'd slip into that night, stay for minutes, then realign to return. And each time, something small would shift. A ladder no longer quite reached the water. The angle of the boat ramp seemed steeper. Jules started keeping obsessive overlays, comparing historical harbour surveys with current measurements, and the maps began to disagree with themselves in ways that made him mutter about subduction and sediment load, until Marin reminded him they were using a magic brass disc, not geology. The first time they encountered Harbour Master Huxley properly was on a jump back to September 1882. Marin had gotten better at navigating the past, bringing a period-appropriate coat and pinning her hair back. Huxley was a compact man with magnificent sideburns and a surveyor's eye, standing on the jetty with a notebook sketching sight lines. The current, he was saying to a worker, comes through at the wrong angle. We'll place stone here, here and here. His pencil stabbed the air. To redirect it. The harbour must be perfected. Marin watched him work through 3 visits, always from a distance. He was methodical, obsessive, piling rocks and driving pilings according to some internal vision of harbour perfection that didn't quite match the water's preferences. And when she returned each time, Jules would show her new discrepancies. The erosion pattern on the south beach had changed. The channel markers had to be repositioned. The harbour was being redrawn, night by night, trip by trip. In the present day, Ms. Corbett arrived with rolled plans and a laptop full of simulations. The coastal engineer spread her designs across the community centre table, while the Harbour Commission leaned in. A new seawall, an expanded marina, all of it backed by models showing storm surge projections, erosion rates, economic impact. The current configuration, Corbett said, laser pointer dancing across cross-sections, leaves us vulnerable. My modelling shows that with strategic hardening here and here, we reduce flood risk by 40%. Marin stood at the back of the room with her father. She could see the problem immediately. Corbett's baseline maps didn't match the harbour anymore. The channel was slightly wider than her model showed. The beach access was in a different spot. Small changes, but they would compound. The seawall would be built for a harbour that no longer existed. We need to stop, Marin told Jules that night. They were at the lighthouse cottage, Grandad Owen pouring tea while Jules spread his latest overlay across the kitchen table. Look at this accumulation, Jules said. 15 trips and we've shifted the harbour mouth almost a metre northwest. Do you know what that does to current patterns? To sediment deposition? Which is exactly why we could fix it. Jules looked up, his eyes bright with that particular intensity that meant he'd been thinking about something for hours. Not stop, fix it. We've been random, but what if we were precise? We've got every harbour survey ever done. We can calculate the most stable configuration, the one that's safest and keeps everything people need. Then we make one big trip, adjust the past and lock it in. Grandad Owen set down his mug. And if you get it wrong, then we try. No! The old man's voice was sharp. You don't get to try again. Every change costs something. You've already moved things that people rely on. What happens when you shift something that puts a boat on rocks, or a house in a flood zone? Marin felt the weight of it settle on her chest. But Corbett's seawall will be worse. She's designing for a harbour that doesn't exist anymore because we changed it, and if we don't fix what we broke... So fix it, Grandad Owen said, but carefully and finally, because a place isn't a puzzle you can solve. It's alive, it changes, and you need to let it rest. They worked for 3 days straight. Jules compiled every historical map, every survey, every photograph. He built a composite that showed where the harbour had been most stable across centuries, which configurations had weathered storms best, where natural currents wanted to flow. Marin charted which changes in the past would create which outcomes in the present, tracing chains of cause and effect through Huxley's obsessive notebooks that she'd photographed on her trips. The plan was delicate. One trip to one specific night in 1883. They would intercept Huxley before his most aggressive intervention, a massive stone revetment he'd placed to block what he called a troublesome side current, but that Jules's data showed was actually essential for flushing sediment. They'd convince him to leave it alone, to place just one carefully positioned barrier instead, and let nature handle the rest. Then Marin would realign the astrarium to match the current night sky exactly, locking the harbour into this new old configuration. It'll protect from floods, Jules said, pointing to his models, keep the boatyard viable, preserve beach access, and it matches the most stable historical average by like 92%. And Corbett's seawall? Won't be necessary, or at least her models will show different results, and maybe she'll design something that actually fits. The night they chose was cold and clear, the kind of November midnight where stars seem close enough to touch. Marin came prepared with careful notes, star charts, and a speech for Huxley that she'd practiced until her father asked if she was rehearsing for a play. Jules would stay in the present, watching his GPS coordinates, ready to document the change. She aligned the disk, matching the past sky pattern ring by ring. The meridian line gleamed in her headlamp. The wave crossed it. The drop. The tilt. The arrival. 1883 smelled of coal smoke and fish and wet stone. Huxley was exactly where Jules's research said he'd be, standing with two workers beside a growing pile of rocks. His lantern cast sharp shadows. "Harbour Master," Marin called, trying to make her voice confident. He turned, and she saw him clock her strange clothes, her impossible presence, but he was a practical man. "You're from the lighthouse?" "Sort of. I need to talk to you about the revetment. It's essential. The current is essential too." She pulled out Jules' printed diagrams, anachronistic and obvious, but Huxley was already reaching for them. The side current flushes sediment. If you block it completely, you'll create a dead zone that fills in. But if you place just this one barrier, here, she pointed, you'll redirect the problematic surge without killing the flow. He studied the papers, his finger tracing the flow lines. "These are remarkably detailed. How did you—" "I've seen what happens if you don't," Marin said. "Please, just this one change. Let the harbour be what it wants to be." Huxley looked at her for a long moment, then at his men, then at the stone pile. One barrier, precisely positioned. "Precisely," Marin agreed. She helped them place it, though the workers gave her baffled looks. It took 2 hours. When it was done, Huxley made her mark it on his charts, committing to the change in his meticulous hand. Then she walked back to the jetty. The sky was changing. Real clouds rolling in from the west, occluding stars. Marin felt panic spike. She needed clear sky to align the astrarium properly, to match tonight's configuration back in 2025. She pulled out her notes, her star app useless across the temporal gap, and tried to remember. Orion at this angle. Cassiopeia there. The Pleiades, where were they behind the clouds? She made her best guess, rotating the rings, her hands shaking. Back in the present, Jules was watching his screen. Corbett had spent the day staking out preliminary markers for the seawall, working from her models. If this didn't work, the Commission would vote tomorrow on a design that no longer matched. Reality. On the jetty in 1883, Marin locked the pin. She could hear the tide rushing in louder than before. One clean wave, that's what she needed. One smooth surge to cover the disk completely. The clouds broke just enough for her to see Orion's belt, and she made one last tiny adjustment. The wave came, it crossed the meridian line and flooded the brass disc in one motion. The world yanked her home. Marin landed hard on the present-day jetty, gasping. Jules was there immediately, grabbing her arm. "Are you okay? You were gone for— How long were you gone?" "Hours, Jules, the clouds, I had to guess. Look," he held up his phone. The harbour spread below them, and it was different. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The channel was wider, cleaner. The boat shop sat properly against the water, the dock a functional length. The public steps curved down to a beach that looked slightly different but completely usable. And on Jules's screen, his GPS overlay was settling, coordinates stabilising into a configuration that matched. Marin pulled out her phone, multiple historical surveys all at once. It averaged, Jules breathed. The changes propagated and averaged into a composite. Look, this matches the 1891 survey and the 1947 survey and the stable period in the 80s. We made a compromise shape. They scrambled up to the harbour office where Corbett was working late, her laptop open. She was frowning at her screen, running simulations again. That's odd, she was saying to her assistant. The erosion patterns are showing completely different. She looked up as Marin and Jules appeared in the doorway. Can I help you? Your seawall design, Marin said. You'll want to check your baseline data. I think the harbour's been surveyed more recently than you're accounting for. Corbett pulled up her models, compared them to fresh measurements her team had taken that afternoon. Her frown deepened. These don't match at all. The entire channel geometry is... She grabbed her phone. We're going to need to resurvey before the commission vote. These projections are wrong. Over the next week, Marin watched the harbour settle. Small daily changes still happened, tides shifted sand, storms moved rocks. But the big jump stopped. The shoreline stabilised into its new shape, and Jules's obsessive measurements confirmed what Marin could feel. It was done. The harbour had found a configuration it wanted to keep, one that echoed multiple pasts and created a more stable future. Corbett came back with new designs, smaller, adaptive. Working with the natural currents instead of against them, she explained to the commission. My initial models were too aggressive. This approach is more resilient. The vote passed, but it was for something different than she'd originally planned. Something that fit the harbour as it was now, not as it had been or might have been. Grandad Owen found Marin at the lighthouse cottage one evening, both of them looking down at the jetty. The brass disc was visible at low tide, gleaming. You did well, he said, but you're done now. Yes? Yes, Marin said. She meant it. Your grandmother told me once that the old keepers felt the jetty move. Little shifts, generation to generation. I wonder if they had the same choice you did, and if they made it. Did they choose right? You're here, aren't you? The harbour's still here. He put his arm around her shoulders. That suggests they chose carefully. Marin and Jules went down at the next low tide with a careful plan. They marked the Astrarium's location on a protected historical site map, documenting it as a significant nautical artefact. Then they positioned stones around it, not covering it completely but making it harder to access casually, harder for someone to stumble upon and turn without understanding what they were doing. The tide would still wash over it, the stars would still reflect in the puddles, but it would take deliberate effort, the kind of effort that meant whoever found it next would hopefully have the same respect for consequences that Marin had learned. Jules ran his final overlay, showing the harbour's shape evolution across their 2 weeks of trips and the final settled form. It looks like a star, he said. From above, an irregular star pattern. Marin could see it. The jetties, the beach curves, the channel mouth. They formed a shape that echoed the brass disc's constellation rings, time and tide written into stone and sand. We should go, Jules said. Your dad wants help with Mrs. Chen's boat. They walked back along the jetty as the tide came in. Behind them, cold water covered the brass disc, and the meridian line disappeared under the surge. The harbour swayed gently, boats rocking at their moorings, waves lapping at stones that had, finally, agreed on where they wanted to be. Marin felt the weight lift from her chest, that constant background worry that something might shift when she wasn't looking. The harbour was done moving, at least done moving in ways that she had caused. The lighthouse beams swept across the water, and for just a moment Marin thought she saw it moving at that older, slower pace, golden instead of white. But then it was normal again, and she decided it was just her memory, just the echoes of all those nights in the past overlapping with the present. Which was fine. Some things should echo, some changes should leave traces. That's how you knew they mattered. She helped her father until dark, then walked home along the shore counting tide pools and checking star positions out of habit. Orion was rising right on schedule. The Pleiades hung where they belonged, and below them, the harbour held its shape, a compromise written in stone and star reflections finally allowed to rest. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The workshop stood at the end of a gravel lane where the county road gave up on pavement and let the woods reclaim it. Jules had walked this path 100 times to visit Master Alder in summers past, carrying mason jars of wild blackberry and listening to the old man's stories about bees that knew the moon better than any almanac. Now the keys hung heavy in Jules's pocket, brass and iron, still warm from Aunt Mara's hand when she'd pressed them there that morning, with eyes too tired for grief. The door groaned open on leather hinges, and the smell hit first. Beeswax and honey, linseed oil, cedar shavings, and beneath it all something metallic and precise, the ghost of 1,000 wound springs. Dust moved in the slant light like pollen suspended in amber. Against the far wall stood the extractor, a radial drum of stained oak and tarnished brass, its treadle worn smooth by decades of feet. Pendulum clocks lined every surface, some stopped at different hours, others ticking in a rhythm that wasn't quite synchronized but close enough to sound like a single vast heartbeat with a limp. Jules set down the duffel bag, the one with drumsticks poking from the side pocket, and a bullet journal wrapped in a bandana to keep the pages from dog-earing. 16 years old and already cataloguing the world in columns and arrows, mapping cause to effect like a good scientist should, or at least like Tali always said a good scientist should. Tali from Physics Club, who could tap out 120 BPM on a table edge without counting, who built motion sensors from old phone parts and called it recycling. Tali would have questions about this place. Jules already had questions. The hive sat in the yard beyond the moon window, that odd circular pane Alder had cut into the south wall, at exactly the angle to frame moonrise over the back field. 6 white boxes stacked in a configuration that didn't quite match the county extension pamphlets Jules had studied for 4-H. The frames inside, when Jules finally worked up the courage to crack the first hive, were wrong in a way that made the skin prickle. Not disease wrong, not pest wrong, pattern wrong. The comb cells formed rings instead of the standard hexagonal sheets. 29 cells in the first ring, 30 in another, embossed and perfect, each one catching light at a slightly different angle. Jules ran a gloved finger across them, and the hive hummed, a sound that wasn't quite angry, wasn't quite content, but felt like both at once, like a cord held too long, waiting for resolution. Inside the workshop, Alder's ledger lay open on the workbench, leather cracked at the spine, pages dense with cramped handwriting and musical notation. At the top of the first page, underlined 3 times, the old man had written, Synodic Rhythm 2953 Solar Days, the comb remembers. Below that, a table. BPM down the left margin, lunar day across the top, corrections in red ink for temperature and humidity. At 58.2 BPM, the notation read, D1, new, moon, cold wax, listen for the A-flat undertone. At 116.4 BPM, D29, waning crescent, warm, the hive will resist. Jules pulled the bullet journal from the bag and started copying, hand cramping around the pencil, drumsticks forgotten. The numbers formed their own rhythm. Every lunar day had its tempo. Every tempo had its corrections, and in the margins, Alder's spidery notes hinted at something else entirely. The extractor is not for honey. The honey is for moonrise. Do not confuse the two. 3 wax cylinders sat on a shelf above the workbench, labelled in Alder's hand. Comb Song D7, Comb Song D14, Comb Song D22. Jules had seen phonograph cylinders before, heard Edison recordings crackle through a horn at the county museum. These were different, handmade. The wax a deep amber that caught light like the honey itself, etched with grooves that seemed too fine, too regular. There was a mandrel attachment for the extractor's drive shaft, a playback head mounted on a gooseneck arm. It took 20 minutes to figure out the setup, another 10 to work up the nerve to spin the drum. The voice that emerged from the horn was Alder's, but younger, stronger, touched with an accent Jules couldn't place. Day 7, first quarter waxing. The comb sings in E major when the moon is ascendant. Spin at 87.6 to match the standing wave. Remember, boy, you're not making honey move. You're making time remember where it's been. The drum turned, the voice spoke through a haze of surface noise, and beneath it all the comb in the extractor, the lunar frame Jules had seated there without really thinking, began to hum. Not loud, not even quite audible unless you held your breath and leaned close. But it was there, a frequency that made the dust lift from the workbench and hang, suspended like the room itself was holding its breath. Jewel looked down. The treadle was moving under one foot, pumping in a rhythm the body knew before the brain caught up. Drummer's instinct. 87.6 BPM. Close enough to the written tempo that the frame's hum shifted, deepened, locked into phase with the turning drum. The pendulum clocks all around stopped ticking. The dust hung. The workshop tilted, not like an earthquake, but like the world had suddenly remembered it was supposed to be somewhere else. And the somewhere else was here, 7 days ago, or 7 days forward, or 7 days sideways into a pocket the calendar had forgotten to mark. When the room settled, the light had changed. Still afternoon, but different. The dust on the windowsill formed the lines Jules hadn't made yet. Outside, the hives stood in the same configuration, but the landing boards were crowded with bees returning from forage, their hum pitched higher, more urgent. Jules stumbled to the door and looked out. The field beyond was full of goldenrod, the kind that bloomed in late September, except it was early October now, wasn't it? Had been before. The bullet journal's last entry was dated October 3rd. This was September 26th. The phone in Jules' pocket had no signal. Not no bars, but no concept of signal at all. The screen locked on a clock that read 4:47 p.m. and wouldn't update. 7 days back. Day 7 of the lunar cycle. First quarter waxing. The comb had sung and the room had listened. Alder's notes said, "To return, feed the queen a teaspoon of fresh present-day honey at moonrise. Not past honey, not future honey. Today's jar, from the shelf, unopened until the moment. Warm it in your hands, let her taste now." Jules ran back inside. The honey shelf held jars labelled by date, Alder's careful script noting moon phase and nectar source. October 3rd, 2024. Wildflower plus aster. The jar's wax seal was intact. Jules cracked it with shaking hands, dipped a silver teaspoon to the level mark engraved on the handle, and waited. The moon window showed only daylight. Hours yet before the moon would clear the tree line. Hours to stand in a workshop that was 7 days younger than it should be, watching dust settle and clocks refuse to tick. When moonrise came, it came as a sliver of white cresting the field's edge, cold and sharp. Jules opened the nearest hive, carefully the way Alder had taught, smoke first, gentle hands, and found the queen by the glow of a red-filtered headlamp. She was larger than the workers, more golden, moving with the slow confidence of something that knew its own importance. Jules held the teaspoon to her mandibles and she drank, delicate and sure, and the workshop shuddered and untilted, and the clocks all started again at once, a cacophony that resolved into their usual half-synchronized beat. October 3rd, 4:47 p.m. The phone signal bars flickered back. 17 missed texts from Aunt Mara, increasingly worried. But when Jules checked the message timestamps, they were wrong. Garbage day was supposed to be Thursday. Mara's shift at the clinic was Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday. Now the calendar on the phone showed garbage collection on Tuesday, and Mara's schedule had shifted to Monday, Thursday, Sunday, and the memories in Jules's head said both were true, or had been true, or would be true depending on which week you asked. Aunt Mara found Jules sitting on the workshop steps at dusk, bullet journal open, trying to map the paradox. "You missed dinner," she said, not unkindly, and then frowned. "Wait. No. That's tomorrow, isn't it?" She checked her own phone and the confusion in her face was sharp enough to ache. "I could have sworn my shift was this morning." "It was," Jules said. "It will be. I think I broke the week." The explanation took until full dark, and Mara didn't believe it until Jules showed her the ledger, played the wax cylinder, spun the extractor without any frame seated, and demonstrated how the room stayed perfectly still, unimpressed. Alder was always strange, Mara said finally, but he wasn't a liar. If he wrote it, there's truth in it somewhere. She looked at the lunar comb frame, still damp with honey, humming its faint chord, in the cooling air. "Can you fix it?" "I don't know," Jules said, "but I think I need help." Tali arrived the next morning with a duffel bag of sensors, a contact microphone, a phone running an open-source tachometer app, and a vibrating metronome strapped to one wrist. "Show me," Tali said, and Jules did. They spent 3 hours mapping the extractor's actual BPM against the dial settings, discovering that Alder's corrections were essential. Warm wax lowered the effective tempo by 1.2 to 1.8 BPM depending on ambient humidity. Cold wax raised it, and the bees themselves influenced the standing wave in ways that defied simple measurement. Tali stuck the contact mic to the drum's centre boss and fed the output through a spectrum analyzer on the phone. "There," Tali said, pointing to a peak that wobbled between 426 and 429 Hz. "That's your lock frequency. When the comb matches that, you're in phase. That's your door." They practiced with short jumps. Day 14, the full moon eve, spinning at 108.7 BPM with corrections for a warm afternoon and active foragers. The room tilted, and they arrived at the night of last year's harvest festival. The field beyond lit with bonfires and voices singing songs Jules half remembered from childhood. They stayed only minutes, long enough for Tali to record the ambient sound, and for Jules to retrieve a pendulum bob that had fallen behind the workbench in that timeline. At moonrise, Jules fed the queen and they returned, and the week reshuffled again. Garbage day moved to Friday. The clinic schedule floated. Tali's physics club lab session, definitely scheduled for Wednesday morning, now showed on Monday afternoon, and Tali's memories insisted both were correct. "This is getting worse," Tali said, staring at the phone's calendar, watching events drift like loose papers in a breeze. "Every jump reorders the last 7 days. If we keep testing, we'll lose track entirely." "Alder knew," Jules said, flipping through the ledger to a page near the back, the ink darker, more recent. "He calls it the 7-frame stitch. 7 consecutive lunar days, visited in order within one present day, then one clean return at moonrise. It resequences everything, resets the week. 7 jumps in one day?" Tali's voice went flat. "That's 7 moonrises. Impossible. Not moonrises, jumps. We visit 7 dates, stay just long enough to mark them, and return here between each one. Then tonight, at actual moonrise now, one final return with fresh honey. The pattern stitches the week back into sequence. And if we miss the BPM? If the comb doesn't lock?" Jules looked at the extractor, its drum scarred and patient. "Then we're stuck, or the week stays broken, or both. Alder's notes say BPM tolerance is plus or minus 0.2. Tali, you can tap 120 BPM on a table for 10 minutes without drifting. We can do this." "We'd better," Tali said, because that afternoon Ms. Braun arrived. She came in a white pickup with Braun Industrial Apiary stencilled on the door, pulling up the gravel lane with the confidence of someone who owned everything she looked at. Mid-40s, sharp-eyed, boots polished despite the mud season. She introduced herself to Aunt Mara on the porch and didn't wait for an invitation before walking toward the hives. Jules intercepted her at the moon window. "Private property," Jules said, keeping voice level, hands loose. Drummer's hands ready to catch a beat or throw it back. "Master Alder kept exceptional stock," Ms. Braun said, not quite smiling. "I've been trying to acquire his queens for years. Now that he's passed, my condolences, truly. I'd like to make an offer. Fair market value, plus a premium for the unique genetics." "They're not for sale." Ms. Braun's eyes flicked to the extractor visible through the workshop door to the lunar frames stacked beside it. "I run a modern operation, dear. Temperature control, artificial comb, maximised yield. Alder's methods were quaint, but productivity demands efficiency. I can give these bees the resources they deserve." She pulled a folded paper from her jacket. "I filed a courtesy inspection with the county. If your apiary doesn't meet current standards, they'll need to be relocated, for public health." "When?" Aunt Mara asked from the porch, voice tight. "End of week. Friday, I believe. Or was it Monday? The county office has been disorganised lately." Ms. Braun smiled then, thin and knowing. "I'm sure you'll pass. But if not, my facility is equipped for immediate rehoming." She left. Jules watched the truck disappear down the lane and felt the weight of 5 days, or 3, or 7, pressing down like a hand on the chest. Tali looked at the ledger, at the 7-frame stitch instructions, at the moon window where the afternoon light was already slanting toward evening. "Tonight or never," Tali said. "The lunar cycle is D10 right now. We need to jump through D10 to D16, 7 days in sequence." "Before moonrise," Jules said. "We have maybe 5 hours." They prepped the workshop like a surgical theatre. Wax thermometer on the workbench, humidity meter on the windowsill, Tally's vibrating metronome strapped to Jules's wrist set to pulse at the target BPM, a stethoscope borrowed from Aunt Mara's nurse kit to listen for the comb's lock frequency. The lunar frames came out of the hives one by one, still heavy with capped honey, each one humming its particular note when Jules held them to the light. The extractor's leather drive belt had cracked earlier that week, whichever week it had been, and they'd replaced it with a jury-rigged length of waxed canvas that slipped occasionally but held. Jules marked each frame with a dot of paint on the top bar, D10 blue, D11 red, D12 yellow, and so on through D16 violet. Corrections, Tally said, reading from the ledger. D10, waxing gibbous, BPM 98.4, warm wax subtracts 1.6, final tempo 96.8. Jules seated the blue frame, checked the wax thermometer, 68 degrees, warm enough, and started, pumping the treadle. The drum spun, picking up speed, the metronome on Jules's wrist vibrating in steady pulses. 96.8 BPM. The comb's hum started low, rose, wobbled, then locked. The workshop tilted and they were there, 5 days ago, late morning, the hives loud with October foragers. Jules tapped the nearest pendulum clock once with a drumstick, a marker, proof of visit, and pulled a single capped cell of honey with a clean knife, dropping it in a labelled vial for humidity calibration. 30 seconds. Back to the extractor. At moonrise in that frame of time, Jules fed the queen, and the room untilted. Back. October 3rd. The week still scrambled. Garbage day Tuesday, clinic Monday. Tali checked the spectrum analyzer. Lock frequency stable. Next. D11. BPM 100.2, minus 1.4 for warm wax. Frame seated, treadle pumping, the metronome pulsing against skin like a second heartbeat. Lock, tilt. This time, early evening, 6 days back, the field bronze with slant light. Clock tap, honey sample, queen feeding, return. The pendulum's tick sounded rougher now, syncopated, as though they were arguing over which beat to follow. D12, 102.0 BPM, warm wax minus 1.5. Jules's legs burned from pumping the treadle, but the rhythm was easy, natural, the tempo a friend. Lock, tilt. 4 days back, afternoon thunderstorm, rain hammering the roof, bees clustered inside the hive boxes. Tap, sample, feed, return. The workshop smelled like ozone and honey and brass polish. Aunt Mara brought water bottles and watched from the doorway, silent, her own phone's calendar flickering like a candle in wind. D13, 103.8 BPM. D14, full moon, 105.6 BPM. D15, 107.4 BPM. Each jump smoother than the last, Jules and Tali moving like a two-piece band locked into a groove, the extractor's drum singing, the comb's standing wave blooming into chords that made the dust rise and dance. The painted frames swapped in and out, each one heavier than it should be, resonant, alive in a way that had nothing to do with bees and everything to do with the moon's slow pull on tides and time and the architecture of attention. D16, waning gibbous, BPM 109.2, minus 1.3 for warm wax, final tempo 107.9, the last frame. Jules's hands shook as it seated in the drum, not from fear but from something else, a sense of standing on the edge of a rhythm too large to hear all at once but impossible to ignore. Tali's metronome pulsed. Jules pumped the treadle. The comb locked, and the room tilted, and they were tomorrow, or yesterday, or the day after the day before, standing in a workshop that was perfectly familiar and utterly strange because it hadn't happened yet. Outside, Ms. Braun's white truck sat in the gravel lane, empty, and through the moon window Jules could see her walking the hives with a man in a county jacket, clipboard in hand. "Tomorrow's inspection," Jules whispered. "We're seeing tomorrow." "Doesn't matter," Tali said. "Mark it and return. We're almost done." Clock tap, honey sample, and then, as Jules reached for the queen cage, a pounding on the workshop door, heavy and official. Ms. Braun's voice muffled. "County apiary inspection. Open up." The knocking came from outside the frame of the jump, from tomorrow's timeline, but it bled through somehow, vibration travelling across the locked frequencies. The queen stirred, agitated. Jules held the teaspoon steady, the present-day honey. October 3rd, wildflower and aster, the jar's seal broken this morning in the reel now, and let the queen drink as moonrise touched the window's edge. The room shuddered and untilted, and the pounding stopped, Not because it had ended, but because it hadn't started yet. Wouldn't start for hours. Back. October 3rd. The moon window showed late afternoon light, the real moon just beginning to climb above the tree line. The 7 frames sat in a row on the workbench, each one tapped and sampled and returned from. They're humming quieter now, harmonising in a chord that was almost but not quite resolved. One more step. Jules took the present-day jar, the October 3rd honey, and held it between both palms, warming it, feeling the wax seal soften under skin heat. Tali watched the moon window tracking the white curve as it cleared the field. 2 minutes, Tali said. BPM doesn't matter for this part, just the honey and the timing. And the queen, Jules said, already moving toward the hives, the jar cradled like something fragile and essential, which it was. The evening air smelled like cut grass and wood smoke. The bees were settling for night, their hum dropping to a low drone, and when Jules opened the hive and found the queen, she was waiting, still, as though she'd known this moment was coming all along. At moonrise, exactly as the first sliver of light touched the hive box, Jules fed her. 1 level teaspoon, the honey golden and thick, tasting of now, of this day, this hour, this breath. The queen drank. The workshop behind them shuddered, a sound like a sigh, and the world clicked into place. Inside, the pendulum clocks stopped arguing and found their rhythm. The dust settled in lines that made sense. Jules pulled out the bullet journal and checked the last week's entries, and they were there, solid, real, events landing on the days they belonged to. Garbage collection, Thursday. Aunt Mara's clinic shifts Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday. Tali's physics lab Wednesday morning. The phone's calendar stopped flickering and locked. The dates stable, the week no longer trying to be 7 different things at once. Aunt Mara stood in the workshop doorway, her own phone in hand, and the confusion in her face had smoothed into something like relief. The medication delivery, she said slowly. It's scheduled for today, not yesterday, not tomorrow. Today, I remember now, correctly. Ms. Braun's truck arrived the next morning for the county inspection. The man with the clipboard checking hive spacing and mite counts and disease signs, finding nothing amiss. The bees calm and productive and humming their ordinary hum. Ms. Braun watched from beside her truck, eyes narrow, and when the inspector signed off, she left without a word, the white pickup kicking up gravel dust that settled quickly in the still air. Jules labelled a fresh jar of honey, October 4th, wildflower and aster, and scratched into the wax seal, for moonrise only. It went on the shelf beside Alder's other dated jars, a marker for some future emergency, some future need. The extractor got a new belt, proper leather this time, and a tag wired to the drum's hub. BPM is a promise. The lunar frames went back into their hives, still humming, still holding their synodic calendar in cells of wax and time. Tali made copies of Alder's ledger, scanned every page, backed up the files, and sent 1 set to the County Historical Society with a note. Beekeeping archive, local interest, methods archaic but effective. The original stayed in the workshop, locked in a cedar drawer with the wax cylinders and the silver feeding spoon. On the wall calendar, Jules wrote across the last 7 days in red pen, kept in time. Not fixed, not corrected, kept like a promise, like a rhythm held steady against the world's inclination to drift. The bees outside worked their ordinary miracles, turning nectar into honey, building comb, feeding the queen, dying and being born in cycles that predated clocks and would outlast them. The moon rose every night at its appointed hour, pulling tides and time in equal measure, and the lunar comb sang softly in the hives, a chord that never quite resolved but never needed to. Jules sat on the workshop steps at dusk, drumsticks in hand, tapping out rhythms on the worn wood. 96.8 BPM, 107.9 BPM, 58.2 BPM for new moon someday when the need arose. Aunt Mara brought tea and sat beside them, not asking questions, just listening to the tap, tap, tap and the distant hum of bees settling for night. The week stretched ahead, ordinary and strange, each day landing where it belonged, and for now, for this moment between moonrise and dark, that was enough. The extractor stood silent in the workshop, its drum empty, patient, waiting. The pendulum clocks ticked in their imperfect unison. The moon window framed nothing but field and sky, and the slow arc of celestial mechanics grinding on, indifferent and precise. And in the hives, the queens laid their eggs in lunar rings, one cell for each day of the synodic month, building a calendar that didn't care what humans called Tuesday or October or now, only that the rhythm held and the comb remembered, and moonrise came when it was called. The next story is about to begin, please relax and enjoy. The storm came at dusk, slamming into the jetty with fists of green water and pulling the sky down low enough to taste salt. Nia had watched it build all afternoon from the harbour master's shed, where she'd been logging tide tables into her phone, tracing the moon's pull across a week's worth of numbers like they were some kind of scripture. She was 16 and had grown up with one foot on planks and the other in charts, reading navigation marks the way other kids read comics, seeing patterns in current and wind that most people mistook for chaos. The harbour was her text. The boats were her alphabet. When the wind finally broke, it left debris scattered along the waterline like offerings. Driftwood, a torn fender, half a lobster pot, and there, wedged against the north piling with its painter tangled in rockweed, a lifeboat. It was old, paint peeling in long white scrolls, bronze fittings gone green with age, wooden thwarts worn smooth by hands long dead. But the thing that stopped Nia mid-step, phone forgotten in her pocket, was the lantern. Copper, tall as her forearm, mounted on a swivel bracket near the bow. Its glass was fogged but intact, and inside the housing she could see a coil of metal, intricate as jewellery, waiting. Gran Maris came down the path with her cane tapping stones, moving faster than Nia had seen her move in months. The old woman had kept the lighthouse before automation came, before the Coast Guard went digital and left keepers to retirement and memory. She stopped at the water's edge and stared at the boat with an expression Nia couldn't name. Not surprise. Something older. "We should tow it in," Nia said. Gran didn't answer right away. The wind pushed her white hair across her face, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of something rehearsed, something held too long in the throat. "Yes," she said, "we should." They hauled it to the town dock with Nia's dad's skiff, and Gran paid the harbour master to let them moor it overnight. Said it was salvage, said she'd file the paperwork, but when they were alone in the fading light, Gran reached into the lifeboat and touched the copper lantern with fingertips that remembered its shape. "It burns seawater," she said quietly. "There's a coil inside that cracks it into flame. Pale fire, cold as starlight. When you light it at night over deep water, the keel leaves a wake you can see from the sky." Nia waited. Gran never spoke like this, never gave away mysteries before they'd been earned. "I want you to have it," Gran continued, "and I want you to promise me you'll leave it dark. There are old nights out there, girl, nights that still exist if you know how to draw the path. But every door you open shifts the frame. Maps aren't fixed. They're agreements. Break enough of them and home stops being a place you recognise." She pulled a rolled chart from her bag, oilskin yellowed with age, and a bottle no bigger than a flask, dusty glass with a cork sealed in wax. The Ye bottle's label, hand-lettered and faded, read Dawn. "This was my grandfather's," Gran said, unrolling the chart on the dock. "He was a navigator on the packet ships, drew these before he died." The chart showed open water, no coastline, just compass bearings and depth soundings. But scattered across its surface were spirals, dozens of them, each drawn in pencil with a date beside it in cramped script. Some spirals looped once, tight as a fist. Others unfurled in 2 or 3 slow turns, wide as cartwheel ruts. Margin notes tracked wind, current, star positions. A scale ring in the corner tied spiral radius to hours elapsed. "What are they?" Nia asked. "Patterns," Gran said. "If you steer the boat at night so your glowing wake matches one of these, direction, size, loops, and close it precisely, the sea goes dark and you slip through. You arrive at the same place but on the night written on the chart, the date loops. You're there." Nia's pulse kicked. "Time travel. Of a kind, not forward, only back, and only on water, only at night." Gran tapped the bottle. "This is how you come home. Fill it at dawn from your own shore. When you want to return, pour it over the lantern flame. It snuffs the pattern and brings you to the now. But if you use the wrong water, you'll land somewhere else, a few metres off. A block. It compounds. The map drifts." "Drifts?" "Home moves," Gran said simply. "Addresses shift. Parcel lines bend. Streets creep. Most people never notice. They think the old maps were wrong, that memory's faulty. But it's real. Every trip changes the territory. That's why the bottle must be filled at sunrise on the exact beach you mean to return to. Home water. Dawn water. It holds the coordinates. Nia looked at the spirals again, at the careful dates, at the handwriting of a man who died before she was born. Her hands itched to touch the chart, to trace the lines, to light the lantern and see what a glowing wake looked like from above. "Why are you giving this to me?" she asked. Gran folded the chart and pressed it into Nia's hands along with the bottle. "Because you're the kind of fool who'll try it no matter what I say. Better you have the rules than learn them the hard way. And because I'm old, and when I'm gone, someone should know the cost." She left Nia on the dock as the last light bled from the sky. Nia didn't wait. She knew she should have. She knew Gran had given her the chart as a warning, not an invitation. But the pull was too strong, the mystery too bright. That night, after her parents were asleep, she walked back to the harbour with a flashlight, the chart and the bottle. The lifeboat rocked gently in its slip, patient as a horse. She climbed in. The copper lantern was cold under her palm. There was a valve at its base, a hose that trailed over the gunnel into the water. She opened it. Seawater hissed into the lantern's chamber, and the coil inside began to glow faint blue, then white, then a colour that had no name, something between lightning and frost. The flame rose without heat, humming like a struck bell. The wake appeared immediately, bioluminescent, milky, trailing behind the keel in a ribbon that didn't fade. It hung in the water like ink suspended in oil, glowing softly, visible even in the dark. Nia cast off. She'd rowed enough boats to know how they moved, how to pull on one oar and push the other to spin in place. She unrolled the chart and chose the smallest spiral, dated last August, just a few months back. One loop, tight, counterclockwise, simple. She began to row. The wake responded instantly, bending as she turned, holding its shape behind her. She adjusted, corrected, watched the glowing line curve in the black water. A quarter turn, half, 3/4. The air grew heavier, the stars brighter. Her breath fogged. She closed the loop, bringing the bow around to meet the starting point, and the wake touched itself, a perfect circle, and the world snapped. Silence. Then sound rushed back, but wrong. Different. Fireworks bloomed over the bay, red and gold, and music drifted from the pier where a crowd had gathered. August, the summer festival. Nia saw her mother, alive and laughing, standing near the bandstand with her dad's arm around her shoulders. Her mother had been dead 2 years. Nia's throat closed. She wanted to call out, to row closer, to touch her mother's hand, but she knew better. Gran's warning echoed. She reached for the bottle, uncorked it, and poured the dawn water over the lantern flame. The light died. The sound cut. The sky blinked, and she was back in the present, floating in the dark harbour under familiar stars. Her hands shook. Her face was wet. She rowed to the dock and tied off, then sat in the boat for a long time, breathing, remembering her mother's laugh, the shape of her smile. It wasn't until morning that she noticed the mailbox. Their house was a 10-minute walk from the harbour, a blue cape with a flagstone path and a cedar mailbox at the street. Nia had walked that path 1,000 times. But when she came home and glanced at the mailbox, something was wrong. It was offset. Not by much, maybe a foot, but it was no longer aligned with the driveway. The stones beneath it had shifted, grass growing in new seams. She pulled out her phone and checked the GPS pin for her address. It was wrong, a metre east of where it should be. She called Ezra. Ezra was a year older, technically 17, but functionally 30 when it came to maps and overlays and drone footage. They'd met in the high school GIS club, which was really just the two of them, and a teacher who let them use the computer lab after hours. Ezra tracked everything, logged coordinates, built change detection models for coastal erosion. If anyone could tell her whether she was losing her mind, it was Ezra. He came over that afternoon with his laptop and a drone in a hard case. They stood in Nia's driveway while Ezra pulled up satellite images, tax parcel, overlays, old property surveys. "Look," he said, pointing at the screen. "This is last month. Your mailbox is here, aligned with the driveway centre line. This is today." He toggled layers. It's moved, and not just the box, the whole parcel boundary. It's bent, like someone pulled it east and it dragged everything with it. "How is that possible?" Nia asked. "It's not," Ezra said. Unless someone resurveyed and didn't tell anyone, but that doesn't explain the Google pin. Pins are crowdsourced, auto-corrected by user data. For it to shift, reality has to shift. Nia told him everything. The lifeboat, the lantern, the chart, the spiral, her mother, the dawn bottle. Ezra listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he believed her. "Okay," he said finally. "We need to test this. Controlled conditions. I'll fly the drone, record the wake from above. You do another spiral, something small, and we'll measure the delta when you get back." They became methodical. Nia would take the boat out at night, light the lantern, steer a spiral from the chart while Ezra filmed from shore with his drone. Each time she closed a loop and slipped through, she'd spend a few minutes in the past seeing things that were gone, then snuff the flame with the dawn water and return. Each time something moved, a fence angled differently, a street sign rotated 10 degrees, a neighbour's address geocoded to the wrong side of the block. Ezra built a drift model, plotting the deltas, calculating vectors. The pattern was clear. The farther back the date, the larger the spiral, the bigger the shift on return. Small trips moved things centimetres. Larger jumps moved them metres. "It's like the map is made of fabric," Ezra explained one night in his basement, showing Nia a simulation he'd built. "Every time you complete a spiral, you pull a thread. The weave tightens in one place, loosens in another. Do it enough, and the whole thing warps." "Can we fix it?" Nia asked. "Theoretically. If you could run a counter pattern, a spiral that mirrors the original but in reverse, it might stitch things back. But you'd need precision, perfect closure, and you'd have to snuff it with water from the exact shore you want to lock home to." Nia thought of the dawn bottle, now half empty. Gran had been clear. It had to be refilled at sunrise on their beach. Home water. But she couldn't stop. The past was too close, too vivid. She started taking longer trips, chasing dates on the chart that promised meaning. A night in the 1930s when pilot whales had beached and the whole town had come to push them back to sea. A rescue in 1895 where a lightship had saved a foundering schooner. Each return brought more drift. The school's address updated wrong in the county database. A paramedic truck took the long route because its GPS believed the road curved differently than it did. People noticed, but they explained it away. Old maps were inaccurate. Surveying equipment had improved. Memory played tricks. Only Nia and Ezra knew the truth. Then Captain Rowe arrived. He showed up at the harbour one morning in a fast rib with twin outboards and a smile that was all teeth. Rowe was maybe 40, tanned and handsome in the way that made people trust him too quickly. He wore expensive foul-weather gear and moved like someone who'd spent his life taking things that weren't his. "Heard you've got a lifeboat," he said to Nia, leaning against the dock piling like they were old friends. "Unusual rig, copper lantern, glows at night." "So?" Nia said. "So I'm a salver," Rowe said. "Wrecks, artifacts, lost cargo. I specialise in finding things that shouldn't be found. And that lantern, that's a tool I could use. It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale," Rowe said. "But I'm not talking about buying. I'm talking about partnership. You've been running patterns, haven't you? Slipping back. I can see the shimmer on the water at night. I know what it means." Nia's stomach dropped. "How?" "I've been looking for a boat like yours for 20 years, Rowe said. "There used to be a dozen. Now there's one. And you have it." He pulled a photo from his pocket, a creased image of a spiral chart. Not Gran's, but similar. "I had a copy made from an old logbook. I've been trying to make it work with modern lights, LEDs, battery arrays. But it never holds. The wake doesn't glow right. You've got the real thing. The copper coil. The seawater burn. Let me use it. I'll pay you. Cash, internship, references, whatever you need." "To do what?" Nia asked. "Salvage," Rowe said. "But salvage that isn't lost yet. Cargo before it sinks. Gold before it scatters. We go back. We mark it. We file claims. Legal. Clean. Just time assisted." "That's theft," Ezra said from behind Nia. He'd been listening from the dock shed. Rowe shrugged. "Maps are suggestions. So's time. If I can get there first, I earned it." "Get out," Nia said. Rowe's smile didn't waver. "You'll change your mind," he said. "Especially when the drift gets worse." He left, but the threat lingered like smoke. Nia tried to stop. She really did. But one night she found a spiral dated 1895, a big one, 3 loops, and she thought of the wreck Gran's grandfather had written about in the margin, a packet ship driven onto shoals in a nor'easter. Survivors none. If she could go back, if she could warn them, steer them clear. She lit the lantern and ran the spiral. It took an hour to complete, fighting current and wind, trimming the wake to match the pattern. When the loop closed, the sea went black as ink, and she was there, storm-tossed, the packet ship a ghost in the fog. She rowed toward it, screaming warnings, waving her lantern. The ship turned. It missed the shoals. It lived. She snuffed the flame and returned to the present. The harbour was wrong. The channel had moved. The main shipping lane, marked on every chart, every GPS, had relocated 100 metres south. Her father's tug contract specified the old channel. It was void. The pier sat over mudflats at low tide. Businesses lost mooring access. The harbour master's office sent emergency updates, but no one understood how it had happened. Nia understood. She had done this. She had pulled the thread too hard. Roe came back that night. "I can fix it," he said. "Let me have the lantern. I'll run a brute force correction, spiral after spiral until the channel snaps back." "That'll make it worse," Ezra said, showing him the drift model. "You'll knot the whole region. It's not about force. It's about precision." "Then teach me precision," Roe said. Nia refused, but Roe didn't need permission. He'd taken a photo of Gran's chart on his phone the day he'd visited. 2 nights later, she saw his Arib out past the breakwater, a crude lantern rigged to his bow, glowing sickly yellow. He was trying to run a spiral. He failed. The wake didn't hold. It frayed, twisted, and when he tried to close the loop, he crossed his own path too early. The wake knotted, a cold whirl forming in the water, a vortex where compasses spun and GPS glitched, and the air tasted like ozone and old salt. The drift spiked, roads bent, buildings geocoded to wrong parcels, an ambulance missed an address and arrived 15 minutes late, a man died waiting. Nia sat on the dock that night, head in her hands, and cried. Gran came down in the dark, slower now, leaning heavy on her cane. She sat beside Nia and didn't speak for a long time. Finally she said, "There's a way to fix it, but you'll have to give up the lantern." "How?" Nia asked. "A counter pattern," Gran said. "The spirals that move the map can stitch it back. You draw a mirror spiral centered on home and snuff it with dawn water from the exact beach you want to lock. It stitches the fabric tight, pulls the threads back into place. But it has to be perfect. One mistake and you'll make it worse. And after, you can never use the lantern again. The pattern will hold, but only if you leave it alone." Nia looked at the dawn bottle. It was nearly empty. "I need to refill it." "At sunrise," Gran said. "On our beach. Home water." They waited for clear weather. A week of storms rolled through, heavy skies and slant rain that turned the sea grey and opaque. No sunrise, no refill. The drift continued to compound, Roe's knot pulling at the edges of reality like a wound that wouldn't close. Then, finally, a morning broke clear. Green flash at sunset the night before, a promise of fair skies. Nia and Ezra met at the beach before dawn, the horizon still dark, the stars fading. Nia uncorked the bottle and held it in the surf, letting the cold Atlantic fill it as the first thread of light touched the water. "Home," she whispered. They sailed before full light, the lantern dark, the charts spread on the thwart between them. Ezra had overlaid the drift model onto a transparency, marked the centre point of the counter-spiral using triangulation. The lighthouse, the bellbuoy, the church steeple. 3 points. A lock. "Radius matches the biggest spiral you ran," Ezra said. 3 loops, counterclockwise. You'll need to compensate for wind and current. If the wake drifts even a metre off the pattern, it won't close. "I know," Nia said. She lit the lantern. The pale flame rose, cold and bright, and the wake began to glow. Ezra launched his drone, the camera tracking from above, feeding the image to a tablet bungeed to the gunnel. Nia could see her own wake from the sky, a luminous thread drawing across black water. She began to row. The first loop was wide, each stroke measured, each adjustment precise. Ezra called headings, keeping her on track, his voice steady. The wind pushed from the west, trying to yaw the boat, but Nia leaned into it, pulling harder on the right oar, letting the current help her curve. 1 loop closed. The wake kissed its starting point and continued spiralling inward. That's when Roe's rib appeared, roaring out from behind the breakwater, spotlight cutting the dark. "He's trying to intercept," Ezra said. Let him, Nia said, not breaking rhythm. He doesn't have home water. He can't land where we're going. Ro closed fast, his rib throwing spray, but Nia was already into the second loop, tighter now, harder to steer. The wake glowed brighter as the pattern converged, the spiral pulling inward like a nautilus shell. "Hold your line," Ezra said, voice tight. A gust hit from the north, unexpected, yawning the arc wide. The wake drifted off the overlay by 1/2 metre. Nia swore, shipped the oars, and grabbed the tiller instead, using a back eddy she'd noticed earlier, a pocket of stillness near the bellbuoy. She slipped into it, let the current swing her bow and threaded the gap, bringing the wake back onto the pattern. Third loop, final turn. Rose Arib came alongside and he leaned over the rail, shouting, "You're going to waste it. Let me through." Nia ignored him. The wake was closing, the glowing line spiralling inward to meet its heart. 10 metres, 5, 2. She held her breath, pulled one last stroke, and the wake touched itself at the centre. The sea went black, mirror black. The stars vanished. Nia grabbed the dawn bottle, uncorked it with shaking hands, and poured it over the lantern flame. The water hissed. The flame died. Silence pressed down like a weight, and then the stars blinked back, and the world snapped into place with a sound like fabric tearing and then stitching itself whole. The wake faded. The sea was just sea again. Ezra checked his tablet, overlaying GPS pins, parcel boundaries, street grids. "It worked," he said, voice hushed. "Look, the lines are relaxing, the drift's reversing." Nia watched on the screen as addresses slid back into alignment, as the harbour channel remet its marked coordinates, as fences straightened and roads unbent. Not perfectly. There was a faint warp still visible in the shoreline, a compass rose bend that would remain forever, a signature only they would know. But home was home again. Rose Orib sat dead in the water, engine sputtering. He'd tried to follow them through, but without home dawn he'd landed somewhere else, some other when. His radio crackled nonsense, his GPS showing coordinates that didn't exist. Nia and Ezra rowed back to the dock as the real dawn broke, spilling gold across the water. Gran was waiting. She took the chart, the lantern, the empty bottle, and nodded once. "You did well," she said. They sealed the lantern in a glass case at the Maritime Museum, labelled it a salvaged artefact, said nothing about what it could do. Once a year, on the morning of the summer solstice, Nia and Ezra walked to the beach at sunrise and filled the bottle with home water. They never lit the lantern. They never drew another spiral. They chose to leave the map where it lay, to let home be home, to keep the pattern without pulling the thread. But sometimes, on very clear nights, Nia would walk down to the harbour and look out at the black water, and she would remember the glow, the way the wake had hung in the dark like a promise, the way the past had opened under her hands like a door. She would remember her mother's laugh, the weight of the oars, the hum of the copper flame. Maps, she had learned, were not fixed. They were agreements, fragile and true, and home was not a place but a pattern you chose to maintain, a spiral you kept closing, a dawn you chose to hold. The sea rolled under the moon, the lantern stayed dark, and the mailbox, for what it was worth, stood exactly where it should, aligned with the driveway, rooted in stone and memory and the kind of truth that only comes from knowing what it cost to bring something back. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.